Chapter 18. "Thanks for coming with me," Greg said, and he slid his hand through her hair at her neck. "You're welcome." Maggie's gaze wouldn't fall from his. She knew he was going to kiss her, and for the first time, she wasn't running. When his lips found hers, it wasn't melting she felt so much as just gratefulness for him being there. After a lingering moment, he pulled back and looked at her. "Can I call you?" She smiled. "You better." Keith had told himself over and over again that he should go. Sitting here by her door was beyond pathetic. However, when he heard the noise first at the front door and then at the stairs, his head came up and he watched for her to appear. It was nearly midnight, and it didn't take a doctorate to know what that meant. "Keith," she said in surprise when she noticed him as she traced down the hallway. "What are you doing here?" He looked up at her as his heart broke for how beautiful she was. "Waiting for you." She glanced worriedly at the doors. "Are they asleep?" He nodded. "You didn't have to wait. Inez could have kept an eye on them." "It's okay." He didn't get up. In fact, he didn't move. "Did you have fun?" She stopped, and after a moment she let herself to the floor against the opposite wall. "Yeah, did you?" He tried to smile. "Izzy's sweet. Peter said his prayers." She nodded, but her gaze didn't leave his face. Finally, he looked at her. "So, are you going to see Greg again?" He tried not to let her hear the shattering of his heart. Her gaze fell from him to her skirt. "He said he'd call me, but you never know what that means. You know how guys are." Yes, he did. He knew exactly how guys were. Keith looked at her, and for all the screaming in his head, he couldn't foist his disaster of a life onto her. "He'll call. Greg's a smart guy." He sighed. "So, are we going to church tomorrow?" She smiled slightly. "If you're up for it." It sounded like heaven. I wouldn't miss it. Keith was back at the mansion the next morning before they had even finished breakfast. "Good morning." Bright and cheery, he sounded so different than the night before. "Good morning to you," Maggie said. "You get any sleep?"
"Keith!"
Isabella squealed, throwing her hands out to the sides. "Izzy!" Keith said, mimicking her. He walked over and gave her a big hug. Maggie eyed him, worried for reasons she knew, and some she couldn't quite figure out. "You're early." "I couldn't stay away." Church was wonderful as usual. To Keith, the only bad thing was when the service was over. His talk with Inez had brought more memories of his mother back. In a strange way, he had purposely forgotten even those things that he loved about her. He wondered about that as they drove home. "What do you remember about your parents?" he asked, not to make her feel uncomfortable, but because he needed to talk to someone who understood. Maggie narrowed her eyes as if she was watching the memories on a fuzzy screen. "Weird things, mostly. Like how my dad liked to smoke a pipe, but my mom wouldn't let him. How my mom put her hair up in a ponytail when she cooked. And my dad always slammed the back door, so we knew he was home. It's strange what you remember." "Yeah." He let himself get lost in memories of his own, most so obscure he could hardly catch hold of them. She looked at him across the Dodge seat. "Why do you ask?" His gaze stayed on the road because he couldn't bear to look at her just at that moment. "Keith?" She sounded so worried. All he wanted to do was put her at ease. However, he couldn't get any words out to do that. He ran his knuckle under his nose to keep the emotions from coming to the surface. He shook his head one way and leaned his head to the other. "Does it ever go away?" Maggie's heart was ripping in two from the anguish on his face. He was trying so hard to hide it, and yet it was right there. What? Missing them. He let his wrist down onto the steering wheel hard. Crud. I'm sorry. I wasn't going to drag you into this. Her gaze never left him. Well, I'm in this, so you might as well tell me. The fact that he never looked at her told her more than she could ever have seen in his eyes. He shook his head again, but only barely. My mom died when I was 12. 12? Her breath slid away from her. Oh, Keith, I'm so sorry. The smile wasn't really a smile, and his gaze never left the road. It's not your fault. Maggie was so focused on him, it was like the rest of the world had dropped away. What happened? It took him more than a second to get the words out. Car wreck. She moaned as her ache mixed with his. They went on a trip one weekend, and she never came back. It was like the only thing I had left was the memories. The funeral? I don't remember much about any of it. I think I only went to the funeral. Besides that, I stayed with Inez. That surprised her. Inez? Our Inez? Yeah, that was back before Dad knew about the wonderful world of nannies. In fact, I don't know that he really cared too much what happened to me or who was taking care of me. He sniffed, and Maggie could tell he was embarrassed by it. They are what got me through it, the staff, but mostly Inez and Ike. It was like taking a whack with a hard tree branch, but Maggie absorbed the pain and kept her focus on Keith. There was so much pain there, so much he wasn't saying, so much she wondered if he had ever said. It occurred to her that the roles from the week before had been reversed, except for the part about holding him while he let it out. Knowing she wanted him to feel as safe as she had felt, she reached across the seat and ran her hand down his soft gray cotton shirt. His arm was solid underneath. He always looked so stylish when he wasn't work dirty. It was a dichotomy she was only now beginning to understand. I don't know how much choice they really had in the matter, Keith said, continuing as though if he stopped, he might break down. I was a pretty attention-hungry kid. Inez would get me ready for school, and the second I got off the bus and changed, I was down at the stables with Ike. For all the animosity Maggie had toward Ike to that moment, she knew then that she would never be able to hate him in the same way again. What about your dad? Keith snorted. What about him? He was never here, and when he was, all he did was tell me everything I was doing wrong. And, believe me, that list got longer every time he got the chance to use it. Vehemence seeped into his tone. I hated him. He hated me. So we just stayed out of one another's way as much as possible. With apprehension telling her she must be out of her mind, Maggie's gaze fell and then slipped back up to him. Is that why he was so mad last week? For the first time, Keith's gaze came over to her. Oh, you noticed that too, huh? It was kind of hard not to. For a single second, his face let that go through it. Then he tossed it off as if it meant nothing to him. I'm just sorry you got in the middle of it. Maggie smiled. It was worth it. Surprise jumped to his face. Her glance slipped into the back seat. The kids had a great time at your place. She considered the foolishness of telling him, but she'd come this far and she wasn't about to step on him like his father had. She let her gaze trail to his face. And I did too. That brought an actual smile to his face, but it was melancholy and poignant. As they turned into the gate, he nodded. I'm glad. Although Keith wanted to stay with her all day, he knew that wasn't possible. The jockey was coming at 2 to take Dragnet through a simulated 2:00 start. They didn't have much time to get him ready, 1 month, so Keith left Maggie with the kids and the car seats in the front door of the mansion. He heard Inez come in from the kitchen just as he escaped out the front door, and he was glad for the timing. It wasn't a stretch to think the maid had her theories about him and Maggie, and he didn't want to hear the innuendos and implied understanding. Inez didn't understand, and the less chance he gave her to act like she did, the better it would be for his heart. Nonetheless, a piece of him stayed right there at that door, with the kids, and with her. And something told him it always would. "I called the realtor," Dallas said on Monday night, and Keith braced for the coming storm. Her voice was cutting and sarcastic. "Thanks to you, that house sold. I cannot believe you let that perfect house slip through our fingers because you're busy." Anger bit into him. "I am busy, Dallas. I know that surprises you, but it's the truth." "Well, I'm not swimming in extra time here either, Keith, but I've gotten everything I'm supposed to do done. Why do I feel like you don't even care about us anymore?" He was spinning through the accusations. "There are other houses. Maybe there's something better." "Better? But that's not the point. The point is, this one was perfect, and because you were too lazy to make a phone call, now it's gone." "You know, you could have made that phone call as easily as I could have." "Do you know how much I have to do? I've got graduation in 3 weeks, finals, I'm studying for the boards, I'm trying to plan a wedding from 3,000 miles away, and you're not helping my stress level." The anger dissipated, mostly because he knew she was right. "Look, I'm sorry, Dallas. Really, I am." He hadn't been concentrating on the wedding or Dallas or anything else in the real world. True, thinking of the wedding brought a tightness to his chest that he couldn't adequately explain, but still he was the groom-to-be. He'd better start acting like it. "Listen, I'll make up for it. I'll find another house, even better than that one." "And where are you going to find this better-than-perfect house?" "I'll make some calls. Surely that wasn't the only wonderful house in Houston." "Well, don't make it too close to Houston. I don't want to live in the city. "Not too close." "And I want a pool, and at least 3 bedrooms, and an office." The list was pushing him deeper into the cushions. "And the kitchen needs to be state-of-the-art. I'd like 2 sinks if possible, and granite cabinets. Oh, and state-of-the-art appliances, and no fake wood floors either. If you get wood floors, I want them real wood." At least she wasn't picky. "I'll make some calls tomorrow." Keith wasn't sure where his week had gone by the next Sunday. Basically, it had disappeared into a dark well of looking at houses and trying to get some work done. The work wasn't so bad. The houses were another story. Bedrooms, bathrooms, backyards, floor plans, financing. It was enough to give a monk a migraine. During the day, he burned up the phone lines. At night, he burned up the modem. He had looked through so many virtual tours, his head felt like it was still spinning. On Sunday, he'd had enough looking. He needed some peace. Showing up on a cold call to the mansion wasn't the best idea in the world, but he didn't have much of a choice. Besides, even if his parents nixed the idea, at least they would know the church thing was his idea and not Maggie's. He rang the doorbell, knowing that just walking in would be a mistake. Inez opened the door. Keith's nerves jumped to the surface. "Hi, is Maggie here?" Slowly, Inez surveyed him head to toe, and her getting Maggie was less than certain. "Who is it, Inez?" His father's voice boomed through the entryway. The maid turned. "Is Keith, sir." Uh-oh, not good, not good, not good. Keith wanted to disappear. If the earth opened up and swallowed him, that would have been kind. His father appeared at the door, and his eyes hardened as he gazed at his son. "I didn't know we had a meeting today." The breath Keith tried to take in didn't get to his lungs. Instead, it lodged at the top of them, making it impossible to talk. I was wondering if Maggie and the kids wanted to go with me to church." The middle of his father's eyebrows narrowed. "Church? Why?" Because I was going anyway, and..." He glanced out to his pickup and wished he had never thought of something so absurd as to come get her. "But that's okay. I can go alone. I'm sorry, it was just a thought." He started to turn, hoping he could get out of here without a yelling match. "Were you planning to take them in that thing?" his father asked, indicating Keith's pickup with a nod. Keith turned back. "Well, yeah, it'd kind of be a long walk otherwise." The joke fell like a pancake under an army boot. However, his father examined him without rebuke. "Inez, page Ramon. Have him bring the car around front." The middle of Keith pitched forward. "The car?" "If you're going to go, you might as well go with a real driver." How his father could give such backhanded assistance, Keith wasn't at all sure. Inez came back. "He's on his way, sir." "Good." His father nodded. "Go tell Miss Montgomery it's time for church." "Yes, sir." Maggie hadn't seen Keith for a whole week, and it was starting to grate her nerves not knowing where he was or if he was all right. She and Greg had talked twice during the week, and although he hadn't asked her out again, that was just a matter of time. Had she met and fallen for Greg first, this would all be perfect. As it was, perfect felt a million miles away. She sat on Isabella's window seat and gazed out at the backyard. She wondered about Keith, if his week had gone well, if the horses were coming along, if things were going well with Dallas. Yes, she would have even taken talking about Dallas to have the opportunity to talk with him about something. "Miss Montgomery?" Inez asked as she knocked on the door. Instantly, Maggie was on her feet. "Yes, ma'am." The look on Inez's face went from happy and hopeful to condescending and cold. "Mr. Keith is here to see you." A joy she had never before felt flooded through her.
Keith!
Isabella said from the floor where she and Peter were playing. Maggie knew she would need all the reinforcements she could get. She swung Isabella to her hip. "Come on, Peter. Let's go see why Keith is here." She followed Inez out the door. "He's at the front," Inez said, but turned for the kitchen. "Okay." Maggie walked to the main staircase and started down it. On the curve halfway down, she caught his gaze, and the smile couldn't be stopped. However, she had to keep it as professional as possible, because Mr. Ayer was standing there watching. "Hi. Inez said you wanted to see me?" "Hey," Keith said. "I wondered if you wanted to go with me to church." He seemed subdued and hesitant. His hands were behind his back, and his head was down more than it was up. "Oh, I don't—" She glanced at Mr. Ayer. "I don't know if the children—" "I've called the car, Miss Montgomery," Mr. Ayer said. "If you would like to take the children to church, I think that would be acceptable." She looked from his father to Keith and back again. "Are you sure you don't mind?" The saddest but almost not there smile she had ever seen met her. "I think it would be good for them." The Dodge was one thing, the limo was quite another. Maggie helped Peter strap in while Keith got Isabella settled. When both children were ready, Maggie sat down on the plush seat that faced backward, and Keith sat next to her, although at the far other end of the seat. He buckled in and then tapped the dividing door. The car rolled out. This was beyond anything Maggie had ever expected. She wasn't made to ride in limos. She wasn't even made to stand on the street corner and watch a limo drive by. Limos weren't a part of her world. However, the thought slid through her that they were how Keith had grown up. That thought stabbed into her as it illuminated in brilliant colors why they could never be together. Nonetheless, she was sure he was enjoying this chance to exhibit his status in the world. After all, wouldn't everyone? Keith hated this. With everything in him, he hated this. In fact, if he would have thought of it, he would have told her he would meet her there. This was like wearing a big sign across your forehead. "Hello, hate me because I'm rich." He tried to quell the crawling shame, mostly because he didn't want to spoil this ride for Maggie. She was staring out her window, surely thinking how far she had come in the world. His gaze drifted over to her silhouette. She wasn't looking his direction, so he let his gaze linger there, watching her. She could even make a limo ride bearable, and for him, That was a stretch. He wanted to ask about her week and the kids, but it was clear she was lost in her own thoughts, so he kept his own to himself. Maggie followed Keith, who held Isabella, up the steps and into the church, wishing it didn't feel like everyone was staring. Their arrival out front had been less than ordinary, and now it was as if everyone in the church was glancing at them, whispering, wondering who they were. Maggie hated the attention, but they were here, so she had to make the best of it. With Peter's hand in hers, she stepped into the bench, and Keith followed her in. Her heart stifled the breath from her when he was once again by her side. There was something about standing next to him, something so familiar and yet exciting just the same. He didn't look at her even when the service started, and that worried her. They stood there together, yet separate, joined by the children, and yet not. It was a strange space in life to occupy. By the time the sermon started, Keith knew with everything in him this was a total mistake. He felt the gazes on them even if he didn't look around to actually see them. Worse, his mind kept going to how right this would feel if he could let himself think that. Her by his side, saying the words and seeming to guide their little group through the prayers without effort. He couldn't explain it, and after a while he stopped trying, if for no other reason than every time he tried, he kept coming to the same conclusion, and it was a conclusion he liked but could never make happen anyway. In complete frustration with himself and everything about his miserable life, he anchored his attention to the preacher. Somehow, Keith knew he had to find something else to think about, or his mind was going to get so tangled it would never work right again. "The pots," the preacher began. "6 pots set off to the side. I wonder if we have ever really thought about those pots. Here's Jesus at a wedding. His disciples are there. His mother is there. And as the wedding progresses, they have run out of wine." Oh, terrific, Keith thought, shifting in his seat. We come to church, and they're going to talk about getting drunk. This is exactly what Maggie needs. Not to even mention me. We shouldn't have come. I knew we shouldn't have come. Now, one thing you have to know is that in this time period, to run out of wine during a wedding celebration was a major insult to all the guests. It would heap dishonor on the host, and presumably the host was a friend of Jesus because, well, Jesus was invited, and you don't invite just anybody to a wedding. So here's Jesus and his friends, and it becomes clear to Mary that they have run out of wine. Mary, on faith, goes to Jesus. They've run out of wine. Jesus puts her off. It's not my time. But Mary, her faith in what Jesus can do never wavering, looks to the servants and says, "Do whatever he tells you." And what does Jesus say? "Take those pots and fill them with water." Take those pots? But what were those pots? If you're like me, you think they were pitchers just like you would normally think you would put wine into. Ah, but that's not what it says. It says, now there were 6 stone water pots set there for the Jewish custom of purification. The Jewish custom of purification. That means those pots are there for the Jews to wash themselves, to purify themselves in order to be clean enough to share a meal. Notice, Jesus doesn't say, take them and wash them with Dawn detergent and then go out, fill them with water. In fact, he doesn't even mention washing them out first. He just says, take them and fill them with water. The preacher paused and looked out at the crowd. What does this mean to us? It's very simple. We are not required to get our act together and then go to God. We are those dirty pots, full of the filth of our lives, even the filth of our own attempts to wash our sinfulness away with our religions and our rules. Those rituals can never save you. Even if you live by the rules, you are still unclean. You still need to wash and be washed. And then Jesus comes along, and without requiring you to get clean first, he points to you and says, "Fill that one with my water." The living water that he refers to later on. Fill her with my water. Fill him with my water. And then, as if that's not enough, he tells the servants to take some of what has come out of these pots to the head waiter, who will judge the wine, the fruit that comes from these dirty, filthy, stinking pots. Think about that. All these people have washed themselves in these pots, and now these servants are going to take what they know was water only minutes before to the ultimate judge to seek his approval to share it with others. Isn't this just like you and me? We are these pots, once filthy and dirty, but now not only filled with the living water, but filled with the wine of a new life. And the fruit that has come out of us is now taken to the ultimate judge. Does the judge take one sip and spit it out in horror at our filth? No. You know the end of the story. He praises the bridegroom for saving the best wine for last. Understand this, the preacher said slowly. Jesus is the new wine. He is the best, and he wants to fill you right now. Not when you get your act cleaned up, not when you've gotten yourself presentable. Right now, he is standing here calling you to be filled with his new wine. The question is, will you let him do it? Will you do whatever he says? Or are you still going to try to do it on your own? It's your choice. Let us stand. Keith could hardly move, and even when he did, it felt like someone else moving him. How many years had he known he was not good enough? How many hours had he spent beating himself to a pulp because he couldn't be what his father wanted? How many hours had he spent first trying to escape through a bottle and then hating himself for being so weak? The guilt was crushing. The deep understanding that he could never, ever measure up was like a 1,000,000-pound weight that he labored to carry every day. Even when they had first started coming to church, he knew it held a peace he hadn't known in years, but he felt so unworthy of the peace it seemed to offer. Now, as he stood fighting to breathe, he realized he was one of those water pots. He was filthy and dirty and vile. He had sin upon sin, worldly answer after worldly answer, and as much as he wanted to gain the peace he could feel being offered here, he had convinced himself he wasn't worthy of it. He was too bad to ever fix, and he knew it to the bottom of his soul. Guilt and shame for all the things he had done swiped through him, raking gashes in the facade of, "I'm all right," as it went. Sins he remembered, and many he didn't, gushed to the surface, reminding him how far he had fallen since he had stood in this space with his mother all those years before. It couldn't be true. It couldn't be as easy as the preacher made it sound. And yet he could see those pots sitting in the corner, dirt-stained and contemptible at the very least. That's how he felt, dirt-stained and contemptible. Fear and shame gripped the grain of hope the preacher's words held, and Keith crushed his eyes closed as the battle rose inside him. "You don't understand, Lord," he prayed in the depths of his heart. "You don't understand all the bad things I've done." And you, Keith, don't understand what I can do if you will let me. The voice was so real, Keith didn't even question its existence. But I've done so many horrible things I can't even forgive myself for. How could you ever forgive me? I can do all things. In fact, I have already forgiven you. All that remains now is for you to accept that forgiveness. He thought the guilt might squeeze his breath right out of him. It was like he was suffocating. His head swam for want of oxygen. How, Lord, how? Trust. Walk through the door I open. and trust that the next step will appear. Keith, Maggie said, and when he came back to the church, she was looking at him with worry. It's over. Are you ready? He looked at her with uncomprehending eyes. His insides were exhausted from the battle. Is it real? Her gaze fell, increasing with concern. What? What you have. Is it real? He really needed to know. What I have? She asked, clearly not understanding. Keith glanced to the front. The praying, the believing. He looked back at her. Is it real? She smiled, but barely. It's the most real thing I've ever found in my life. For the first time, he took a real breath, and slowly he nodded. Then I want that. I want what you have, but I don't know how. I don't know how to be there where you are. Can you show me? His gaze seemed to sink into hers. I'd love to. Chapter 19. Maggie knew she was pushing her luck, but she also knew who she had on her side, and so she put the day in his hands and let go. When they got back to the mansion, Patty Ann met them at the front door. It was enough to make Maggie question God's sanity. "Where did you take the car?" Patty Ann asked in angry exasperation. "The Ayers will be late." Pulling Isabella closer to her side, Maggie lifted her chin. "We went to church, and we took the car because Mr. Ayer said we should." Patty Ann surveyed Keith, clearly knowing he was to blame for this, but Maggie held her ground. "Mr. Ayer didn't say anything about him needing the car." "That's because Mr. Ayer didn't know about the Cooper's brunch in—" Patty Ann looked at her watch and went ashen. "Oh my, I've got to get them in that car, or they are going to be far more than fashionably late." She practically ran up the stairs. Keith was all but doubled over as his gaze stayed on the floor. Hesitantly, he glanced up at her. "Well, I'd better get." The thought seized her with a vehemence that took her breath. Quickly, she darted a glance up the stairs before she bent closer to him. "Come back and get us in 30 minutes. Confusion slid over his face, but she was perfectly calm. "Trust me." Keith waited until the limo had been gone for 10 minutes before he had the guts to go back to the mansion. Even then, he parked on the trail close to the kitchen. His heart was jumping through his chest, and at the door he had to exhale hard to get his emotions to calm down. He opened the door and found Maggie a whirlwind of activity in the kitchen. He let the door bang softly behind him, and when she looked up and smiled, life stopped. "Oh, good." She licked her finger and slapped the 2 pieces of bread together. "Inez is off, so don't laugh at my cooking." "Okay." "The car seats are right there, if you'll get them ready." Keith picked them up, questioning his sanity. He must be crazy. That was the only logical explanation for any of this. "So I'm driving," Keith said when they were all in the pickup and strapped in. "Mind telling me where we're going?" Only then did Maggie hesitate. It was nearing 100 degrees outside, and keeping the children out in that for hours didn't sound like a great idea. "Well, you said you could drive out to the waterfall if you had to." "There's a couple places that are a little scary." "Depends who's driving." Keith was amazed. Maggie had weathered the bumpy, uncomfortable trip out to the falls with grace and humor. She was simply amazing. There was no other word for her. At the falls, she unpacked lunch. She fed Isabella. He helped Peter. When lunch was over, Maggie told the kids to play under the tree, and both seemed so happy to be there again, they obeyed. "Now," Maggie said, sitting on her knees and pulling one last thing from the lunch basket as the peaceful sound of the falls enveloped the afternoon. "Were you serious about what you said at church? About being where I am?" Reaching up to scratch his collarbone, Keith nodded. "Well, then I brought you something. It's not new or anything. If I'd have had the chance to get a new one, I would have, but you didn't give me a lot of notice." With a short breath, she handed it across to him, never really meeting his gaze. It was a black leather book with a worn zipper around the outside. The lettering across the front, faded to a nearly unreadable gold, held 5 simple letters. Bible. "It was my parents' Bible," Maggie said softly, looking more at it than at him. "It's what I have left of them." Gratitude and guilt smashed together in the middle of him. "Oh, Maggie, I can't." She smiled serenely. "Just until you get one for you." Gently, reverently, Keith held the Bible, fighting not to let his hands shake for the trust it represented. He slid the zipper around it and let it fall open. For all the wear on its outside, its inside was remarkably intact. Maggie watched him as he flipped it first one page to another. "One thing that really stuck with me was that I remember Mrs. Malinowski telling me that faith isn't just believing He's there. Real faith is trusting Him to guide your every step to your greater good. He wants that for you, you know. Your greater good." Protests crowded through him about his own life, but he chose to use hers as an argument. "But how can you believe that? How can you trust a God who took away your parents?" Her gaze fell. "This life isn't perfect, and there are things that happen, bad things set in motion by people who make really bad choices. God does not alter the physical laws of this world. If velocity says a car traveling at this speed hits another at that speed, there are consequences to that impact. God allows the laws here to work so that we can live our lives. Otherwise, if the law of gravity worked sometimes and not others, we couldn't even walk out of our house because we might float off the planet." She paused and then shook her head. "But there's more to it than that. God can take anything, and use it to teach us, to strengthen us, to guide us, if we let Him." Her gaze found Keith's. "Sometimes it's the things that are the hardest that teach us the most." "But if He loved us, He wouldn't let bad things happen?" There was nothing to do but nod. Maggie's gaze went over to the children. "What if Peter needed an appendectomy? Emergency situation. You have to make the decision. Do you sign the paper to allow them to operate on him?" Confusion slid through Keith. "Well, yeah." "But it's major surgery. It's going to be painful for him." "But he'll die if I don't." Slowly Maggie let that sink in. That's what God knows, that without our learning to trust His love in the good times and in the bad, to trust that He knows best what will ultimately give us life, we will die, because we'll never have His life in us, and His life is what will live forever. If we don't have that, we die. Keith wanted to argue, but he didn't have the words. "I know it's a lot to absorb in one day," Maggie said with compassion. "But the good news is, He doesn't require you to know it all. Just take this step, this one right here, that's all. He knows where you're going, and if you trust that, He will show you the next step, and the next, and the next." "Like the doors," he said as his mind processed what she was telling him. "Huh?" "You know, the doors the preacher was talking about the other day. How God opens one door, and when you walk through that door, He will open the next." "Yeah, like that." Still he clung to the arguments. "But how do you do that? How do you remember?" "Well, how do you remember to feed each horse every day? You've got to have, 10 of them?" 12. "But that's got to be hard to remember to feed them every single day." Keith shrugged. "No, not really. You just get used to doing it. Once you do, it's not hard to remember." Maggie nodded, and although it took a moment for the depth of that to sink in, Keith finally caught what she was saying. "It's not one big declaration, and it's done, Maggie said. It's remembering in the little moments in your life to trust him, to trust what he's guiding you to do, to listen, and to know with everything in you that he will lead you exactly where he meant for you to go. Like praying and living with him. That's not me trying to prove I deserve for him to live in my life. It's a sign that he is. Simple as that. But it sounds so hard. So, I don't know, big. It is big, but he doesn't require big. He asks you to take one step. Walk through one door. Maggie nodded. Trust me, he's more than capable of opening those doors in front of you. Are they all easy? Her eyebrows shot for the sky. Walking through those doors? He nodded. On your own, they are some of the hardest things in the world to do. In fact, the world will most likely think you are crazy for doing them. Look at Mother Teresa of Calcutta. Any normal person would have balked at going into the places where she went. The home of the destitute and dying doesn't sound like a fun place to spend your life. Yet she did it because that's where God put her. Concern seeped into him. I couldn't do that. You don't have to. All you have to do is what he gives you to do. That's what's so cool about God. He doesn't think you have to be someone else before he'll love you. It's not a contest. He loves you right now, right here, just like you are, like the water pots today. But don't people go off into missions and stuff? They can, but they don't have to. Mrs. Malinowski lived in Del Rio her whole life, but she was right where God put her, doing his work. Sometimes it's the little things, those things that the world doesn't see and will probably never know about, that mean the most to those whose lives they touch. She shook her hair out of her face. I, for one, am grateful she answered his call. Her taking just that step probably saved my life. I sure wouldn't be who I am today if it wasn't for her. Keith gazed at Maggie, his heart falling through the peace and serenity there. Thank God for Mrs. Malinowski. Monday night, Keith was sitting on the couch with a Bible open in his hands when the phone rang. He reached for it without really paying attention. Hello? His gaze continued to absorb the words on the page. Well, it's about time. Where have you been? Instantly, Keith sat up and closed the Bible. Dallas. Yes, Dallas. Did you forget about me? No. Why? It's Monday night. You always call me on Monday night. It's like these days we don't talk unless I call you. Guilt crawled over the peace he had had for 24 hours. Sorry, Dallas. I've been busy. I know. Did Farrell call you yet? No. He hated that admission. Well, Dad talked to him today, and he's decided to give you another chance. She didn't sound particularly happy about that. They'll call you to confirm, of course, but he's got you scheduled for Thursday at 3. I'm telling you, Keith, guys like Farrell don't ever give guys like you a second chance. Trust me, Dad had to pull all the strings there were, so do not mess this one up. Nothing in Keith liked any of this. Fine, I'll do my best. No, Keith, not your best. You get that job, whatever it takes. Anger stamped through him with army boots. Anything else? Yeah. Have you found a house yet? No, kind of. He felt like he was on the inspection line, and he was failing miserably. I found a couple you might want to check out online. His thoughts spun away from him even as he tried to catch them. Here, let me get to my computer. And for the next hour, they played house shopping via phone lines and modems. By the time they were going through their 5th virtual tour, Keith was exhausted. He didn't care about tile and granite and landscaping. He just wanted to get back to the black book lying on the coffee table in the living room. It represented the only sanity left in his life. Oh, I forgot to tell you, Dallas cooed when she was sufficiently convinced he had actually been looking for a house. "I found an Aston Martin concept car I am going to do some checking into. It is the coolest thing you have ever seen." Confusion went through him. "Don't you still have your Jag?" "Well, yeah, but I can't show up at Hayden and Elliott in a Jag. Everyone will think I'm poor." She laughed as if the thought was ridiculous. "I mean, come on. By that point, I'll be Mrs. Keith Ayer. I have to make a statement, you know." She sounded so excited about being Mrs. Keith Ayer. Unfortunately, she didn't sound nearly as excited about being married to Keith. "I'm going to make an offer of $1 million. We'll see where we go from there." $1 million? Keith choked on the word. "It will probably have to be custom-made. They aren't mass-producing them yet, so that's even sweeter." Oh, hang on." She left as Keith's mind spun through the car and the house and the move and the wedding. "Keith, listen, Chris Ann just showed up. We are going shopping for my trousseau. Let me know when you've seen the houses we looked at in person. Maybe we can go together when I get home." The calendar on the pegboard stared back at him. May 13, Dallas's graduation. Less than 3 weeks away. He was no longer breathing. "Gotta go. I love you," she said. He mumbled something incoherent, said goodbye, and hung up. It was only 9:30, but overwhelm tramped through him, and without going back to the living room, he turned for his bedroom. Maybe, if he was really lucky, he would go to sleep, and this whole nightmare would be just that when he woke up again. Maggie wondered how he was doing with the Bible. She hadn't seen him since Sunday, and although her sensible side said she was crazy, a little voice in the recesses of her heart kept saying, "Call him." On Tuesday night, she waited until the kids were down and the house was quiet before she snuck down to the kitchen. Quietly, carefully, she grabbed the phone and slid into a chair. Wishing the buttons wouldn't beep so loudly, she dialed the number. As it rang, her glance chanced across the clock. It was 11:15. He was in bed. She shouldn't be calling him. "Hello?" He didn't sound asleep, exactly. More distracted. "Hey there," she said softly. "Did I wake you?" "Maggie?" There was a hint of hope in that name. "Yeah, it's me. You can't get rid of me, huh?" "That's a problem." "I don't know, is it?" He inhaled and then exhaled as if he was pulling life in and releasing every bad thing trapped in him. "It isn't to me." They had talked for over an hour about him being up well past dark, sitting here in his living room with a little lamp over the recliner on as he read the Bible. He had so many questions, so many things he had read that he wanted some guidance on. She answered the ones she could. The ones she couldn't, they talked over until he was satisfied in what they had come up with to explain it. It was so easy to talk with her, so natural and relaxed. He had the feeling that he could ask her anything, and she wouldn't jump all over him for being an idiot. As the clock started back up toward 1 o'clock, he knew he had to let her go. But he had one more question that was dogging his every step. "Okay, one more question, and then I'd better let you get some sleep," he said. "Okay." He took a breath because the question seemed so pivotal to everything. If someone gave you $1 million, what would you do with it? She didn't say anything for a long, long moment. "Well, I'd take some of it and put it toward scholarships for foster kids. That's the only way I got to go, because someone else had thought to make a scholarship available. And then—" Keith waited as his heart filled with her first answer. It wasn't a car. It wasn't a fancy house with granite countertops. It was helping someone else out. He liked that. "Well," she didn't continue right away, "I've never really told anyone this." Something told him they were now swimming in the depths of her being, just like the night they had spent on his couch. He waited, wondering what came next. "I want to be a foster mom someday. I want to give back what I was given, a chance, a life, a shot at normal. I want to give that to as many other kids as I can." Her voice faded out on the soft dreams. "So, I'd use whatever was left to do that." Nothing in him had a hard time picturing her, a gaggle of kids in a rainbow of colors around her. There was no doubt in him that her presence with them would be a turning point in their lives. It sure had been in his. "Well, I hope someday you get that chance," he said, wishing only that he could join her dream instead of being stuck in his own. "Mr. Ayer," Tanner said on Wednesday as Keith worked to fix the gate leading to the track. Ike was busy with Dragnet, and the gate was all but non-functional. Just to open it, you had to drag the whole thing, and it was getting so bad that dragging it didn't even work anymore. "Yeah." Keith lifted the gate from its hinges, swung it to the side, and leaned it against the opposite fence. The support pole it had been attached to leaned awkwardly to the side, pulling the rest of the fence with it. He went back and examined it, pulling it one way and then the other. Whoever had poured the foundational concrete obviously didn't know what they were doing. It was cracked and chipping, and so unstable that the pole had no choice but to fall. "What's up?" Keith grabbed the shovel from the fence. "Would you bring me that wheelbarrow?" "Oh, sure." Tanner did as instructed. "Listen, I hate to ask this, but Jamie's been all over Pine Hill, and everybody she's interviewed with wants a full-time employee if she's going to work for the summer. She's going to school the second summer session starting in July, and full-time's just not going to work. I know there's probably nothing, but she wanted me to ask if there was something she might do out here, just to earn a little gas money." With a whack of the shovel, Keith knocked a whole chunk of the concrete loose. He scooped it up and dumped it in the wheelbarrow. "I don't know, Tanner. The only thing I really know much about is the horses, and except when you and Ike are gone, we've pretty much got that covered." "Well, what about when we're gone? I mean, surely there's something." Keith gave another good whack, and the pole wobbled. "Here, hold this, or the whole fence is going to come down." Tanner went to the other side of the pole and put his hand on it. In one motion, it was stabilized. Keith continued to whack the concrete and dig it out from around the pole. "We're going this weekend with Q Maine," Tanner said. "Maybe she could come and feed the horses to give you a break. She's really good with them, and if anything was major wrong, she could always call you." The concrete was now coming out in large chunks, deeper and deeper into the hole Keith dug. "Well, I'm going to be out of pocket tomorrow. I've got another interview with Farrell in Houston." At that, he cracked the shovel against the last few base chunks. He'd been trying to forget that interview. "So I guess you can bring her over and show her the ropes." "Really?" Keith liked the hopeful sound in Tanner's voice. He wished there was a millionth of that hope in his own. "Sure, why not?" "Miss Montgomery? Telephone," Inez said, knocking on her door after the kids were in bed. "Okay, thanks." In one motion she was out of bed and had her robe on. Racing down the stairs, she willed herself not to trip. Through the kitchen to the phone, she nearly slid right into the window before she got stopped. "Hello?" "Maggie!" Her heart slid through her. "Oh, hi, Greg." "Hey, listen, I don't have much time, but a bunch of us are going out tomorrow night. I was wondering if you wanted to go." "No!" screamed through her. She sat down on the chair in a heap. "I have to work." "Maggie, for Pete's sake, you're their employee, not their slave. Ask off. They can't make you work 24/7. Some part of her said he was right, but the rest of her was saying she would rather be here, doing her job, than out with him and his friends. But she could hole up here and pass up every opportunity, and then what? Get fired and have nothing? That didn't sound like a great plan either. Besides, Greg was a pretty respectable plan B. "Okay, I'll ask." Chapter 20. 10 a.m., Houston, Texas. Noise, people, cars, chaos. Keith hated every second of it. He strode into Devonshire Incorporated, knowing somehow he had to make this work. For Dallas, for his father, and for Mr. Henderson. Anything less than wowing Mr. Farrell would be another giant nail in his coffin. He rolled his shoulders around, trying to get them to be comfortable in the dark business suit as he walked from the elevator to Mr. Lee Farrell's secretary. "May I help you?" She didn't sound happy, nor even really alive, more like a machine. Yes. I have a 10 o'clock appointment with Mr. Farrell." "One moment, please." She punched 2 buttons on the phone in front of her. "Your 10 o'clock's here, Mr. Farrell." "Yes, sir." She punched the button again. "He'll be right with you." Patty Ann?" Maggie knocked softly on the secretary's door. "May I speak with you?" "Come in, Miss Montgomery." At her desk, Patty Ann sat ramrod straight, her red suit jacket looking like it was still on a hanger across her shoulders. "Is there a problem?" No, ma'am." Maggie slid into the black upholstered chair and fought the shiver that always attacked her in this room. "I know it's really short notice, and I'll understand if you say no." Actually, she was hoping Patty Ann would say no. That would solve a lot of problems. "But I got invited out for tonight, and, well, I was wondering—" Patty Ann sighed. "Like I said, I know it's short notice." Patty Ann narrowed her gaze on Maggie, causing another shiver. "Only tonight?" "Oh, yes, ma'am, and I wouldn't have to actually leave until 7 or so, and I will be here tomorrow morning as usual." There was a long pause as Patty Ann surveyed her. "Very well. I'll make arrangements." "Mr. Ayer," Lee Farrell, a short little weasel of a man, said from behind his enormous desk, "I do not have to tell you that I'm a very busy man, but in deference to your father-in-law, I have made an exception. So, tell me what assets you can bring to Devonshire Incorporated that I am not aware of." Keith had never felt so small. He cleared his throat. "As we talked about before, I've got managerial experience." "Yes, with horses." Mr. Farrell's sarcasm dripped from his words. "That's impressive." "And I've got an MBA from A&M. "Yes, as every other applicant does." Mr. Henderson, however, hinted at a more, shall we say, a more enticing incentive. Very slowly, Keith shifted in his chair. "What incentive was that?" Mr. Farrell's gaze fell to the desk. "Well, Devonshire and Ayer Industries have several intertwining interests as well as several competing interests. The power grid, the dovetailing of their mutual assets, the thinning of the competition between us, coupled with your future wife's connections, could be very, shall we say, convincing." It was literally as if the devil was sitting across that desk saying, "You can have all of this." The problem was, this devil had leverage like none other. The legalities alone were enough to crumple Keith's knees, and he fought not to squirm under them. "Well, sir, I don't know if—" Farrell lifted his chin, his eyes flashing with malevolence. "Don't forget, your father-in-law has a lot riding on your answer. I am personally a large contributor to his bid for re-election. So please, consider carefully." Keith's gaze fell to his hands. "We can negotiate your salary. I am quite sure your contributions will be worth whatever you ask." $1 million car and a house the size of Vermont flashed through his mind. This could well be the answer to the question of how he would ever pay for Dallas's dreams. However, his spirit was screaming that this was wrong, horribly, horribly wrong. To accept a job that he would hate forever, a job that would put his character, honor, and integrity in jeopardy, a job that would erase who he was from the planet forever. How much money was worth that? His father would be furious, not to mention Dallas and Mr. Henderson. Then, like a sojourn in an oasis amidst the chaos, Keith's mind traced its way to a little church, in a little pew, standing next to the only one in the world who made him never apologize for who he was. What she would say was a question that didn't even need to be asked. His heart told him the answer. This wasn't right, and it never would be, no matter how much they wanted to convince him that it was. He stood slowly, knowing this decision would cause a chain reaction he couldn't clearly see the end of. However, he knew this was a door he couldn't afford to open. "I'm sorry for taking up your time, Mr. Farrell, but I'm going to have to decline the offer." The little man's eyes narrowed to the point that he was glaring at Keith. "Son, declining this position is not in your best interest. Your father-in-law—" "Well, sir, I think accepting this position is not in my best interest, and if my father-in-law has any integrity at all, he will understand why I cannot accept your offer." Keith held his hand across the desk, but Mr. Farrell never moved. Finally, he let his hand drop, and he walked to the door. "You are making a grave mistake, Mr. Ayer." At the door, he stopped, breathed through the thoughts of each fork in this particular road. The thought of taking the job coiled around him, sucking the air from his lungs so that suffocation seemed likely. Then he pulled in a full breath as the thought of opening this door that led to 1,000 unknowns went through him. There was no challenge, no barrier to that breath. It was the only confirmation that he needed. With that, he opened the door, stepped out, and never looked back. Maggie knew as well as anybody what today was. She and Keith had talked about it under the tree on Sunday. Today he took another step away from her into his new life with Dallas. It hurt, but all day long Maggie had prayed for Keith, that the right doors would be open to him so that he and Dallas could have the best start in life possible. Just before dinner, Patty Ann showed up at the door to the playroom with a woman whose eyes were so dark they were almost black. The rest of her was small shoulders, thin arms, hands with long, spindly fingers. Across the room, Peter took one look up and shrank back against the cabinets. "Miss Montgomery, Mrs. Haga is here to relieve you for the evening." Maggie stood there, stunned into speechlessness. Mrs. Haga? Why had she not remembered this was a possibility? Mrs. Haga stepped into the room. "Come, children, it's time for dinner. We must get washed up." "Oh, they've already been—" There was no hesitation as Mrs. Haga glared at Maggie. "They are children. No amount of washing will make them perfectly presentable, but we shall try. Come, children, now." She clapped her hands with the words, and Peter scrambled to his feet. The look on his face ripped through Maggie with such force she could hardly breathe. But they were already being marched across the hall. "You are officially off duty, Miss Montgomery," Patty Ann said, and with that, she closed the door. Slowly, Maggie sank to the window seat. How could she go back now? How could she tell them what that monster had done to Peter? The thought of leaving them here like this threatened to annihilate every sane thought she could manage to think. And yet, what was the alternative? Marching downstairs to take them back? Telling Patty Ann? Calling Greg to tell him no when he was probably already on his way? "Oh God," she prayed softly, "they are just babies. Please protect them." Dallas made the connection on Keith's cell phone 10 minutes before he got back home. He had stopped at Walmart for supplies, and something about just walking and thinking had kept him there far longer than he should have stayed. It was almost 7 when he got to the last turn before the gate. He'd even decided against going to the stables. Surely Tanner and Ike and Jamie had been able to handle everything. "So, how did it go?" Dallas asked in anxious excitement. "The first hurdle. Well, he made me an offer I couldn't refuse." "Fabulous!" Dallas squealed. "Tell me all about it. I want the details." He was far more casual than he ever thought he could be. "Well, there's only one that really matters." "What's that?" She had never sounded more excited. "I refused it." That stopped her. Refused it? Refused what? The job. The offer. All of it. What? She laughed, kind of. Keith, that's not funny. I'm not laughing. You told them no? He let out a solid breath. Yes, Dallas, I told them no. Are you out of your mind? She was shrieking now, and Keith had to hold the cell phone away from his ear lest he go deaf. Dad put his reputation on the line to get you another interview, and you turned them down? Well, her father had put someone's reputation on the line, but it wasn't his. Keith turned into the gate, and his heart slammed into his rib cage. There, sitting at the base of the mansion steps, sat Greg's little silver sports car. For one reckless moment, Keith thought about stopping, but instead he gunned it to get behind the trees before they came out. Seeing them together would have been more than he could take. I cannot believe this. How stupid can you possibly be? That was the job of a lifetime. What were you thinking? You couldn't have been thinking. You couldn't have. You turned down an offer that would have set us for life. She was still shrieking when he turned the pickup into his driveway and punched the garage door. She was shrieking, but he was no longer listening. Keith's mind went to where they were going on a Thursday night. The movies, a play, dinner, dancing. There wasn't an option he liked. Just the thought of them together was enough to toss his sanity overboard into waves of helplessness and hurt. Keith! The incessant diatribe stopped. Keith! His name brought him back as he put the pickup in park and got out. What? Are you listening to me? The correct answer was no. The prudent answer was, sorry, what did you say? I said we could still get you another interview with Farrell. Maybe he would believe there was just a misunderstanding and you were playing hardball. Dallas. He stopped her. This discussion was becoming annoying. I'm not going back. I don't want to work for Lee Farrell. I don't want to work at some firm that sucks your life out to inflate their bottom line. Keith, wake up. This is the real world we're talking about here, not some dinky little pet farm. Now, we are a month from walking down that aisle, so you'd better get your head pulled out and start thinking like a man instead of like a little kid, or we're going to have a serious problem on our hands. Look, I'm not cut out for office life. I never have been. You have an MBA. What were you going to do with that? Feed horses your whole life? He did not have the sanity to explain that the MBA was his father's idea, nor that feeding horses all day was what had kept him from throwing himself off a cliff for all those years. Instead, he shook his head. I've got to go. Go? We're not finished yet. Yeah, well, I am. And he clicked the phone off, threw it to the counter, and went to take a shower. Trapped in this monkey suit, he felt dirtier than he had his whole life. Give me a good scotch any day. It's the best way to unwind, Greg said as they sat at the bar waiting for their table. Are you sure you don't want anything? He tipped the glass up until the ice cubes clinked against the side when he put it down. No thanks. Maggie's gaze wandered through the darkened bar area of the restaurant. She had never been in a place so fancy. She knew she should be adequately impressed. However, the only thing she could concentrate on was how badly she wanted to go home to check on how Peter and Isabella were doing. Dear Lord, please keep them safe. The shower hadn't helped much. Keith knew he should be worried about Dallas and what happened next, but that paled in comparison with the fact that Maggie was out with Greg. Again. The sun had dipped below the horizon, and Keith stepped out onto the porch, a beer in one hand, grief filling his heart. He leaned there on the doorpost and gazed across the patio to the swing she had sat on so many nights before with Greg. He couldn't get a clear picture of Greg, but he could see her as if she still sat there. He took a drink, pushed away from the doorpost, and ambled over to the swing. All he wanted was to get closer to her, even as it felt as if she was moving away. He sat down hard on the swing and let his mind wind through the memories. That first day, her coming down the stairs and falling into him, her walking with him after they got her car put away, sitting at the waterfall, riding horses, showing up with the kids at the stables, praying at Peter's bedside, sitting amidst a kitchen splattered with pink yogurt. Fighting to push the memories from him, Keith took another drink. And then one memory seeped through all the others. It was her, standing at the window looking out into the dark night as the kids slept behind her. That memory tore through him, and ache for her pain clutched him. He remembered her crying in his arms, telling him about her parents and how life would have been so different if only someone she would never know hadn't made such a horrible choice. A horrible choice. Keith's gaze fell to the can in his hand. How many horrible choices had he made? How many times had he just wanted the hurt to stop so badly that drowning it seemed the only option? As he gazed at that can, he saw with perfect clarity the life it had doomed her to live. It wasn't a hard choice, more one that came of its own volition. Slowly he reached his hand out past the swing to the lawn beyond, and, like the water trickling over the sides of the falls, he poured the rest of the liquid out. He closed his eyes, feeling the desire for it go. Then he sat back and let himself feel what life was like on the other side of that door. A scotch before dinner, 2 glasses of wine with dinner, and now they were at the bar with Greg's friends. Thankfully, Virginia wasn't invited to this little soiree. At least, that was one thing to be grateful for. "Dance?" Greg asked, standing from his chair and offering Maggie his hand. She put hers in his and let him lead her to the floor. Once there, he took her in his arms, and she put her head on his chest, more so she didn't have to look at him than because she wanted to get closer. He bent his head so his mouth was close to her ear. "You've been awfully quiet tonight. Everything all right?" Her thoughts flashed to Peter and Isabella. They were in bed by now, and her heart panged at the thought of not being with them. "Just a little worried about the kids," she said softly. Greg backed up a little. "The kids?" "Peter and Izzy." She shook her head to keep herself from crying. That brought a look of true incredulousness to his face. "Why would you be worried about them? You're not their mother or anything." Maggie ducked her head and forced herself to breathe. She huddled closer to him because running wasn't an option. The feel of his arms around her was so different than Keith's. She fought not to notice that, but she did anyway. Her heart filled her chest at that thought, and the tears came again. Greg was nice, but he would never be what she really wanted. What she really wanted was Keith. But he was so far out of her reach, all hoping would do was end up hurting her more. No, she may not like it, but Greg was here, and she was going to have to be happy with that. With everything in him, Keith wanted to call the mansion. Just talking to her might make the spinning of his life stop for a while. Still, without even being there, she had guided him through 2 decisions that he knew would change the course of everything for him. If only he could tell her that. "This one, right?" Maggie asked as she pulled the little sports car up through the parking lot to Greg's space. "Good memory," he said, the words slurring together. When the car was parked, he looked over at her with a goofy grin. "Well, we're home." "Yes, we are." He continued to look at her in a way that was making her very nervous. "I guess you're coming up to call a cab?" "I guess so." It was not what she wanted to do. Carefully, she unwound herself from the car, and when she got around front, he was waiting for her. With his hand on her back, they walked up the stairs to his apartment. Once inside, he went to the cabinet rather than to the phone. Would you like something to drink? She couldn't believe he could even ask the question. No thanks. I'd better get home. She walked over to his phone and pulled out the phone book. Across the kitchen, she heard the clink of ice cubes. Quickly, she pulled the phone up, dialed the number, and asked for a ride. However, midway through the phone call, she could feel him right behind her. Even after the cab company was gone, she held the phone, stalling a few more seconds. Finally, she knew she couldn't stand there holding the phone until the cab came, so she hung it up. She turned and tried to smile at him. Well, thanks for tonight. She pulled her purse strap up her shoulder and anchored it there with her opposite hand. I had fun. You know, Greg set his drink on the countertop behind her. You really don't have to leave. I'm free all night. He leaned into her, and the smell of alcohol and smoke on him was overwhelming. That's nice, she pushed him away. But really, I have to get home. It's after 2. So? He leaned in again, this time more forcefully. So, I have to be up in 4.5 hours. All the more reason to stay. His breath, hot and sticky, grazed her neck as his hands brushed her hair back off her neck. Maggie shrank back from his advance until she was pinned to the counter. Hey, Greg, listen, not tonight, okay? I've really got to go. She was breathing heavily, but not for the reason he obviously thought. Still, he advanced. The cab's not going to be right here. We could at least finish off the night right. Greg, hello? She used both hands and arms to get a wedge between them. Stop it. Maggie. He pawed the back of her head. Maggie, I want you so bad. The sound of the horn out the front was the best thing she had ever heard. The car's here. She pushed to get free of him. Greg, the car's here. I've got to go. And with that, she broke free and fled. The trip home was the longest ride of her life. It compared only to the moves she had made to different homes, only this ride was different than those. This time, she was trapped, not by someone else's mistakes and decisions, but by her own. How could she have been so blind as to trust Greg? Sure, he was a nice guy, but nice guys tended to not be so nice when the alcohol took over. She had learned that frightening fact more than once. It had happened often enough throughout her life to make her leery of the next time it did. Lest she drown in the memories, she forced herself to think of something else. The kids were her first thought, and that too brought a slap of pain. She had left them in the clutches of a monster. Why? Because she didn't want to let Greg down? How stupid was that? She leaned her head back on the seat and watched the lights of Houston stream by. So many, many things she would change if she could. So many heartaches she never wanted to feel again. As her mind wound to the one that could change everything, a single tear escaped her eye, and she didn't even reach up to brush it away. He had his life, and as scant as it was, she had hers. That was how it was, and she had to either accept it or let it kill her completely. The trouble was, she couldn't decide which would hurt the most. Friday morning, Maggie awoke with a start. Her first thought was how badly her head hurt. Her second was that the sun was up and brighter than normal. With a jerk, she looked at the alarm clock. They had 15 minutes to be downstairs for breakfast. In the next breath, she was up and grabbing for her clothes. It took less than 4 minutes, and with no makeup coupled with a ponytail corralling the hair she hardly brushed, she raced first to Peter's room to wake him up. Peter, it's Friday morning. Time to get up, sweetheart. The child rolled over and rubbed his eyes. Come on, sweetie, we're going to be late for breakfast. She went into his closet and grabbed an outfit. I'll be right back to help you. With that, she ran across the hallway to Isabella's room. The blinds were shut, causing the room to be a deep, shadowy gray. Baby girl, hey, good morning. She went to the crib and laid her hand on the child's back. "Wake up, little one. It's breakfast time." In Isabella's closet, she turned on the light and took out a pink outfit complete with baby capris. She snapped the light off and strode for the crib. Still asleep, Isabella barely moved as Maggie picked her up and took her to the changing table. It was like she was on autopilot, and in no time the little girl was changed and ready, except that she was still asleep. Maggie tucked her onto her shoulder and went to help Peter. "Morning, little man. How are you?" She laid Isabella on Peter's bed and helped him with his shirt and then his pants. Frantically, she raced to the closet for socks and shoes. Sitting on his bed, she swept him up to her lap and worked the socks and then the shoes on the little feet. He rubbed his eyes.
Are you leaving today?
"No, sweetheart, but we're going to be fired if we don't get down to breakfast, like, super fast." Maggie stood him off, leapt to her feet, and grabbed up Isabella. "Come on." "What are you going to do, then?" his father asked in dissatisfaction as Keith sat across from the desk, having been summoned for a meeting he would rather have skipped. "I'm not sure, but Devonshire is not it." That much, and only that much, he was sure of. His father frowned. "You do realize that Dallas is accustomed to living at a certain level. Lowell is beside himself with worry for her." "I'm sure. Not to mention himself," Keith thought. "But there are things in this life that are more important than having enough money to make everyone else respect you." "Humph. Like what?" "Like respecting yourself, and having values and principles you don't sell down the river for a few bucks." How he felt so calm, he had no idea. He slid his fingers together loosely. "We'll be okay." Displeasure crossed his father's face. "How do you know that? You don't even have a job lined up, nor, according to Lowell, a house." "Because something's going to work. I just have to wait for the right doors to come open." His father's face fell further. "You're talking in riddles, Keith. You have to make some solid plans here. You can't keep a wife happy on dreams and hopes and wishes. Dallas needs you to be a man and to start accepting your responsibilities." "Even if that includes selling myself down the river to the highest bidder?" That stopped his father's rant. Keith shrugged. "I'll find something, but it's not going to be at Devonshire." Seeing no way to convince his son, his father stood. "Well, I hope you know what you're doing, because Lowell is going to eat you alive if this doesn't work." He led the way to the door as Keith stood and followed him. "I'll tell you one thing's for sure. Lowell is not pleased, and that's a dangerous line to be crossing." They walked into the hallway. 2 steps, and his father changed the subject. "So, is there a race this weekend? I was wanting to take Vivian if it's not too far away." "Yeah. Q Main is racing at Harrah's tomorrow." Keith stopped at the base of the stairs, and his attention snapped up as Maggie and children came nearly flying down them. "So Ike and Tanner are gone already?" his father asked. Yeah. They left yesterday afternoon." "Oh." Maggie pulled up short midway down the bottom curve. "I'm sorry, sir. We're a little late for breakfast." Concern slid through Keith. She looked pale and harried and not at all like the Maggie he knew. "Yes, I believe Mrs. Ayer is waiting for us all," his father said. He turned to Keith. "I guess that means you'll be taking care of things this weekend." "Here?" His father glanced at his children and pursed his lips. "I think it might be wise if you check in on things, just to make sure." On cat feet, and without directly looking at Keith, Maggie slipped past them. Her heart was set on permanent spin. "I smell waffles." She shook her shoulder a bit. "Izzy, time to wake up, baby. Waffles." They walked into the dining room, and a face that would have frozen Africa met them. "Well, it's about time," Vivian said. "Miss Montgomery, if you are going to take time off to go on your little rendezvous, I expect you not to be late and keep the rest of us waiting." Mr. Ayer stepped in behind her. "I'm sorry, ma'am, really. My alarm clock didn't—" "This is not a time for excuses. Vivian rapped on the table. "Inez?" Like she was a trained seal, Inez appeared with a stack of waffles and a plate of sausage. "It's turkey sausage, just as you requested, ma'am. Would you like anything else?" "A glass of orange juice, please," Vivian said, and Inez walked out. You would think, after all these years, she would know not to set the milk in front of me. Ugh. Vivian picked up the crystal pitcher and handed it to Maggie to put down the table. Maggie was still trying to wake Isabella up. She set the pitcher next to Peter. "Izzy, sweetheart." Only then did the child move, just a little. "Vivian," Mr. Ayer said as he forked into the waffles. "Keith just informed me that one of the horses will be racing in Louisiana this weekend. I thought it might be a good time to get away, what with a wedding coming up and all. It might be our only chance before the middle of June. I thought we could leave this evening, if you want to." "Do you have the box secured and the hotel booked?" He waved the question off. "I'll get Charisse to do it when I go into the office today." Mrs. Ayer glanced at Maggie. "Who will be watching the house?" "I asked Keith to keep an eye on things, and Patty Ann will be here, too." She looked all but horrified. "Keith? Are you sure that's a good idea?" He stopped eating for a moment. "He needs some responsibility on his shoulders. Maybe that will help him get his head on straight." She sighed dramatically. "Well, I guess it would do me some good to get away for a weekend. I certainly won't have a chance after this." Maggie said, pulling the child off her shoulder and sitting her on her lap as she tried not to listen to the conversation. "Let's eat some waffles, little one." The little girl shook her head slowly, her curls sliding across Maggie's rib cage. Worry snapped into Maggie. "You don't want waffles, but they're your favorite." Again, Isabella shook her head. Maggie corkscrewed her mouth as she looked down at the child. "I don't think you feel very good. We're going to have to let you lay down a little." She stood from the table. "I think I'll just take her upstairs." Instantly, Peter was on his feet.
"I'll go too."
Maggie looked down at his plate with a full sausage and nearly as much waffle left. "Why don't you stay down here and eat?" He wound his hand through hers.
"I want to go with you."
Seeing no other option, Maggie nodded. "If you'll excuse us." By lunchtime, Isabella was decidedly sick. Even the pediatric hydration liquid hadn't stayed down. The night before was looking less and less worth it all the time. For the third time that day, Maggie put Isabella in her crib with the child already asleep. She laid her hand on her back and said a soft prayer. Then she turned and took Peter's hand as they tiptoed out. "Miss Montgomery," Patty Ann said, striding down the hall and meeting them at Isabella's door. Instantly, Maggie held her finger to her lips. "Shh, Izzy isn't feeling good." "Yes, well." Patty Ann waited until the door was closed, but didn't lower her voice. "I wanted to inform you that the Ayers are going out of town this evening, so they will not be at dinner." There were moments to thank God for small favors. This was one of them. "Okay." "They will be back Sunday afternoon at 4, so I hope you are not planning any last-minute absences." No, ma'am." Maggie felt Peter huddling behind her knee. "I'm here for the duration." Patty Ann scowled. "Good." With that, she turned on her heel and stalked off. Maggie looked down at Peter. "Ugh, she's fun. Let's go see what we can do while we wait for your sister to get better." It was stupid to even think it, but he knew they wouldn't get many more chances like this. At 5:30, Keith left the stables and drove to the mansion. His parents were gone. He'd seen them leave. Dinner was at 6, and he didn't want to miss it. "Oh, baby girl, your little eyes look awful." Maggie sighed and looked at her watch. Across the room, Peter played with his blocks. "I guess I'll have to see if Inez will let us eat up here. You don't look like dinner material." Knowing she was going to get reamed for it, Maggie went down to the kitchen. "Izzy's still sick. Is there any way we can take some plates upstairs and eat up there?" Inez looked horrified. "Eating upstairs? Patty Ann would fire me on the spot." "Well, Patty Ann is gone for the day." Maggie put her hands on her hips, not willing to roll over and play dead. "Peter is hungry, and so am I. Izzy can't come down here, and I'm not leaving her up there in the shape she's in. So that doesn't leave us many options, does it?" Keith heard the voices in the kitchen and followed them that direction. "But Miss Montgomery, one spot on the carpet, and you know—" Her words trailed off as Keith walked in. He looked at Maggie, and overwhelming worry snapped into him. "What's wrong?" Maggie crossed her arms. "Izzy's sick, and I can't just leave her up there to bring Peter down here to eat. And, unfortunately, I can't split myself in half to be in both places at once." She glared at Inez. The oppressiveness of the house was obviously beginning to grate her nerves. "Oh." Keith didn't want to make the suggestion because he had really hoped they could eat together, but it was the best option. "Well, I could eat with Pete, and then I could watch them while you eat." Her gaze was less than certain. "You're eating here tonight?" "Looks like it." Maggie was in the rocking chair with Isabella again, holding her, stroking her hair, when suddenly she felt something strange at the back of the child's head. Worry collapsed over her. "What's this?" Rounded out, it felt like the outside of a golf ball. Isabella let out a whimper of pain as Maggie lightly rubbed across it. "Knock, knock," Keith said, softly knocking on the door as he and Peter appeared there. Maggie barely looked up. "We brought you some dinner, smuggled it up ourselves, right, Pete?" Proudly, Keith produced the plate, but Maggie hardly noticed. The plate in his hand lowered along with his eyebrows. "What's wrong?" "Come here and feel this." Keith set the plate on the dresser and strode to where she sat. He sat down on its heel and gently ran his fingers over the place Maggie was feeling. The second he touched the spot, Isabella whimpered past the thumb in her mouth and huddled closer to Maggie. Concern dragged Keith's eyebrows together. "What happened?" "I don't know. I was just holding her and rubbing her hair, and I felt that." His scowl deepened. "Did she fall today?" "She's been sick all day. Even this morning, I couldn't get her to wake up." "Did she fall last night?" I don't know. She was with—" Maggie's mind snapped into gear, and she looked over to where Peter stood, pressed against the door. "Peter, did Isabella fall last night?" Keith spun slowly to look at the child, who looked like he was facing a firing squad. "Pete?" Maggie reached her hand out to stop Keith. "Don't scare him." Keith nodded, but stood and went to the little boy. He sat down on his heels to be eye level with Peter. "Pete, what happened to Izzy?" Peter looked over Keith's shoulder to Maggie for help.
I didn't do it.
Anger and guilt slid through her. She should never have left. "It's okay, Peter. We know you didn't do it. Come here." It was clear he didn't want to, so Keith picked him up and carried him to Maggie. "It's all right, Slugger. You can tell us." At Maggie's chair, he stood the child on the floor but kept his hand on Peter's back as he sat back down on his heels. "It's all right. We won't be mad. We just need to know what happened." Tears the size of grapefruits welled in the little brown eyes.
She slipped.
"On what?" Maggie asked, her heart turning over.
On the floor.
His gaze fell to his shoes.
Mrs. Haga was mad.
Maggie's gaze went to Keith, who looked at her with horror. "Can you start at the beginning, Pete? Tell us everything that happened." He didn't start immediately, but Keith rubbed his back slowly to assure him it would be all right.
We were taking a bath, and Izzy was playing like she always does when she hits the water. Mrs. Haga told her not to, but Izzy didn't listen. So Mrs. Haga said she had to get out.
The story slowed to a crawl.
She took Izzy out of the bathtub and stood her next to it. I don't know why, but Izzy started to walk away, and
He was obviously fighting not to cry.
Mrs. Haga grabbed Izzy's arm and pulled her backward. Izzy slipped.
And hit her head on the tub. Maggie finished for him. Miserably he nodded.
I didn't know she was going to do that, or I would have told her not to.
There were tears in Maggie's eyes, too. How could she have been so selfish? She knew something like this was going to happen. Mrs. Haga didn't tell anyone? Keith asked, his voice strangling through the question. Peter shook his head slowly.
She told me not to.
I should have known, Maggie said in horror. I should have known. Keith looked at her with patient, gentle eyes. How could you have known? She gazed right at him. Lying wasn't even an option. Because it's happened before. The words hit Keith like shots from a double-barrel rifle. They knocked him backward on his heels. What do you mean it's happened before? When? Maggie hesitated, but only for a second. The last time I left, when I went to your party. With Greg. The volleys to his heart were coming fast and hard, and Keith had to force the air in to keep himself calm. Peter had marks on his arm the next morning, bruises. Fury knocked through him as he stood and paced away from her. And you didn't tell anybody? Her voice shook, and fear snaked through it. I didn't know who to tell. They were as liable to blame me as anyone, and then where would the kids be? He spun. Well, you could have told me. She shook her head. You were busy with Dallas, and besides, her gaze fell. I tried. That stopped him. Tried, but you never said anything. Tears crowded her eyes, and anguish slashed across her face as she looked up at him. We went down to the stables, but... Her gaze fell from his, heavy with words she wasn't saying. But? Twisting as if in the breeze, her gaze darted one way and then the other as she fought not to cry, but she sniffed anyway. I saw me waiting for you, and, well, he wasn't very happy I was there. Slow understanding sunk into Keith. That day Tanner found you walking. She nodded as despair crumpled over her. I didn't want to make things bad for you. I didn't want to get you into trouble. Her tears overflowed their banks as she ducked her head. I'm so sorry. I should have told someone. I should have done something. Oh, no, Maggie. He knelt down in front of her and reached his hand to just under her ear. No, listen. I'm the one that's sorry. He pulled her to him as the tears streamed down her cheeks. I'm so sorry I wasn't there. His own grief pulled to the surface as he held her there sobbing. Ike didn't know. He couldn't have. She nodded but pulled back. There she wiped the tears from her eyes even as new ones took their place. I think he thought that I was... Maggie's gaze fell between them, laden with embarrassment. She corralled the tears, but the effort was obvious. I figured the less we bothered you, the better. Keith closed his eyes, willing himself to stay calm. When he opened them again, his determination to protect them all was steel hard. Now, you listen to me. He narrowed his gaze at her. If you ever need anything, all you have to do is call. I am right here. His gaze burrowed through hers. Got it? Slowly she nodded, and the tentative trust was clear. Good. His gaze fell to Isabella. Now, do you think we need to take her in, or what? Chapter 21. It was midnight before they got back from the emergency room. Thankfully, the bump was just that, a bump, with a very slight concussion that would not be a problem. Because of lack of sleep and the emotional day, Maggie was completely exhausted by the time they laid the kids down and made it out into the hallway. She didn't even have the sanity to make a fast getaway. Maggie, Keith said softly when they were standing at her door. I wanted to tell you thanks. She turned to him incredulously. Thanks? For what? For trusting me enough to tell me. For coming to tell me the first time it happened. I just wish I had been there. Gently, he pulled her to him, and his arms were the best place she'd ever been. He felt so safe and so indescribably stable. I meant what I said about calling me if you ever need anything. His embrace fell away, but his hands found her arms. He lowered his gaze to hers. Okay? She nodded, but couldn't be fully certain this wasn't just some nice dream she had somehow fallen into. Now, get some sleep. You look exhausted. Yeah, she tried to laugh it off. After not getting back until like 3 a.m. last night, I feel like I've lived 6 days in one today. Concern slashed through Keith. Why didn't you get back until 3? In the next second, he knew he shouldn't have asked as why smacked into him. Oh, you know, those cab drivers have a racket going, she said, laughing again. But Keith wasn't laughing. Cab drivers? What happened to Greg? She shrugged and let her gaze find the darkness at her feet. He was drinking. If she was trying to make him crazy, it was definitely working. Maggie, why didn't you call me? Because it was 3 a.m. She laughed softly, even as her hand came up to her other arm. Besides, what was I going to say? Hi, Keith, it's me. My date is over. Come get me. Irritation scratched through him. Well, that would have been better than you riding alone in some cab all over the countryside in the middle of the night. The overpowering need to protect her jammed into his chest. Now, you listen to me. I do not want you calling cabs to take you home in the middle of the night ever again. Annoyance flashed through her eyes as her gaze jerked up to his. You're not my father. Besides, how else was I supposed to get home? Walk? No, you were supposed to call me. She sighed, and it was obvious she was tired. Look, Keith, I don't want to argue, especially about this. He corralled his own emotions. Yeah, okay. We can talk about this tomorrow. Go get some sleep, and don't set your alarm for in the morning. I'll cover for you. Panic slid through her face. For breakfast? He smiled. And lunch and dinner, the way you look. He lifted his chin. Now go get some sleep. Saturday, Maggie slept in, and it was like the best vacation ever. They spent most of the rest of the day together, except for the time Keith had to run to the stables to check on things. Isabella was feeling better, at least she was playing now. At dinner, they talked about everything and nothing in particular. It was strange to Maggie how easy Keith was to be with, so unlike Greg, who seemed to be more show than substance. By the time they tucked Peter in and said their prayers, Maggie found herself wishing this never had to end. So, are we going to church tomorrow? Keith asked as she made it to her door. Bright and early. She opened her door. You know, Dad and Vivian will be back tomorrow. Something in his voice stopped her. We have to tell them. You know that, right? Dread slid through her. He was right, and she knew it. However, nothing in her wanted to face them with this information. I think we should do it together, he said slowly. If you want me there. Maggie turned. His presence filled the space between them. He was there, gazing into her eyes with concern and hope. I don't want to get you into trouble. And you don't deserve to be in trouble. So, if we both go. Are you sure? Very. Church flew by, and in no time they were out at the stables so Keith could check on things. There was no reason for them to be there, really, other than neither Maggie nor the kids wanted to see him go. At the stables, they got out of the pickup and walked to the barn, Maggie holding Izzy in one arm and Peter's hand with her other hand. This won't take long, Keith said. A young woman dressed in faded jeans and a t-shirt strode out of the barn. She had long blonde hair, and she was shorter even than Maggie by several inches. Oh, Mr. Ayer, she said, putting her hand up to block out the sun. I didn't know you were coming. Tanner said I was supposed to feed them." "I just wanted to make sure you remembered," Keith said with a smile. Then his glance chanced to Maggie. "Oh, Jamie, this is Maggie." He put his hand on Maggie's back, and her pulse jumped into a higher gear. "Hi, Maggie." Jamie stuck out her hand, and Maggie shook it. "Hi." "And this is Isabella and Peter," Keith said proudly. "It's nice to meet you." Jamie stepped up and stuck her hand out to Peter. "You're a cutie." He smiled slightly. Jamie ruffled his hair. Then she stood and looked at Isabella, who was curled on Maggie's chest, sucking her thumb. "And you are adorable." Jamie ran her hand gently over Isabella's curls. "It looks like somebody could use a nap." Keith nodded. "Maybe we should head on back to the house since Jamie's got this under control." "No problem," Jamie said, stepping away from them. "Y'all take care." "We will." They walked to the pickup. "She's nice," Maggie said. "Tanner's girlfriend. She's helping out a little to make some gas money." Maggie nodded. "Well, Tanner has good taste. I'm glad to see him with someone so nice. He deserves it." The rest of the afternoon they stayed in the air conditioning of the mansion. Isabella didn't need to be out in the heat, and neither of them really wanted to be either. So they spent the afternoon in the kids' rooms, playing, wrestling, reading, and resting with the kids. It was nice to have a day to just do nothing. However, the reprieve couldn't last. When the Ayers announced their return downstairs, Keith looked at Maggie, and she knew it was time for the Inquisition. "You ready?" he asked. Had there been a way to say no, she would have. Instead, she nodded, and with him holding Izzy and Maggie's hand in Peter's, they walked out. Down the stairs they went, trooping one behind the other as if marching into enemy territory. "Welcome home," Keith said, far too happy and normal-sounding for Maggie to match. "Well, it looks like it's still standing. That's something," Mr. Ayer said, gazing at them as they made their descent. "We won. Cumane ran a great race." "That's great, Dad," Keith said. "Really great." Mr. Ayer nodded and smiled happily. "I think I'll give Ike a raise. He deserves it after that one." "Hello, Peter." Vivian reached down and gave her son the obligatory hug. "Did you have a good time?"
Uh-huh. We went to see the horses today. Horses,
Isabella said, but there wasn't much of a squeal. Maggie looked down at her. No, the bouncy child of a week ago still hadn't returned. For an awkward moment, no one said anything. Then Keith exhaled ever so slightly. "Dad, Vivian, we need to talk." Mr. Ayer's face went ashen with the tone in Keith's voice, and suddenly Maggie knew why. It's about the children, sir," she said before he could misconstrue Keith's intentions any further. "Can't this wait?" Vivian whined. "We just got home." "No, I'm afraid not," Keith said. "It's pretty serious, and we wanted you to know what's been going on as soon as you got home." Mr. Ayer looked more confused than displeased. "Could we go into your office?" Keith said, and his father nodded. "I'll let the kids with Inez for a minute," Maggie said, grateful that she didn't have to follow them all down the hallway. She took the kids to the kitchen and told Inez she would be back. It took everything she had to walk down that hall. When she slipped into the room, Keith was waiting for her at the door. He guided her to one of the mahogany wood chairs covered in expensive black leather. He sat next to her, his parents on the other side of the desk. Keith cleared his throat. "We wanted you all to know that we found a bump on Isabella's head on Friday night. It was pretty good-sized, and we took her to the emergency room." "A bump?" Vivian asked incredulously. "What from?" Keith glanced at Maggie and then leveled his gaze on his father. "We managed to get the story out of Peter. It seems that the fill-in babysitter yanked Isabella and made her slip. She fell and hit her head on the tub, causing the bump. We filled out a report on her at the hospital. It's standard.
But she's been our villain for years, Vivian said. She wouldn't.
It wasn't the first time. Maggie pulled in a breath and let out her fear. She hurt Peter the last time she was here. I saw the bruises on his arms. He told me she shook him really hard. He's terrified of her.
But,
Vivian started. Mr. Ayer folded his hands on the desk. Are you sure about this? Keith never flinched. There's no doubt. They walked out together so his parents could discuss the situation. With her arms wrapped at her chest, Maggie walked slightly in front of him, not saying a word. Are you okay? He asked with concern. I just hope they don't think I did it. Peace flowed through Keith. Dad's smart enough to know we were telling the truth. They got to the front door and Keith stopped. Well, I guess this is where I get off. She spun toward him. You're leaving? He grinned and winked at her. What? Did you think I was going to stay forever? Sadness went through her. A girl can hope, can't she? Mrs. Haga has been notified that her services are no longer needed, Patty Ann said stridently. So until further notice, you are on duty. I understand, Maggie said, nodding. The secretary's office seemed even colder today. That means you are not to even consider asking off until we have cleared someone new. Yes, ma'am. And just so you know, that may not be any time soon. Why did this feel like a sentencing session? Don't worry about it. I don't plan on going anywhere anytime soon anyway. Monday night, Keith drove into Houston. There were some things that needed to be said face to face. He climbed the steps to the second-floor apartment and knocked. Putting his hand on his hip, he waited, rehearsing what he had come to say, just as he had been for all of 24 hours. Keith! Greg sounded happy to see him when he opened the door. Come in, buddy. This is a surprise. I thought you must have forgotten where I live. No, just haven't had much time to make the trip recently. Greg walked into the kitchen. Can I get you something, Bud? Coors? The thought made Keith ill. No thanks. I'm driving. From the refrigerator, Greg checked him with a disbelieving look. Never bothered you before. Greg laughed as he brought one into the living room for himself. Keith sat down on the couch. His gaze went to the coffee table as fuzzy memories of games of quarters drifted aimlessly through him. The parties were legend, and yet they didn't hold the amusement they once had. He retrained his gaze to his friend. So what brings you all the way down the mountain? Well, Keith said, shifting slightly, this is probably not my place, but I have to say something because it's going to drive me crazy if I don't. Greg took a drink. Sounds serious. It is. Keith paused to gather his courage. It's about Maggie. Maggie? Greg's head snapped up incredulously. It took another breath to get the words out. Do you know about her growing up? She said she grew up in Del Rio. Keith watched Greg take another drink. Did she tell you why? Greg shrugged. I don't know, because she liked Del Rio? It was all Keith could do to keep himself from knocking Greg flat. No, because she was an orphan. Across the room, Greg's face fell with a can. She grew up in the foster care system. Her parents died in a car accident when she was 8. Concern slid over Greg's features. Why didn't she tell me this? It gets worse. Keith knew this was betraying every confidence she'd ever trusted him with, but he had to say it, had to get Greg to understand so he would stop being an idiot and hurting Maggie. They were hit by a drunk driver. A drunk... Greg looked down at the can and thought for a long, long minute. That's why. Yeah. Keith's place in this situation had been left so far behind, it was no longer even in the rearview mirror. Look, I don't want to step on any toes here, but her riding out into the boondocks in some cab for an hour by herself is not exactly safe. I told her she could call me, but I don't think she'll do that. Greg shook his head. Is she mad at me? No. It killed him to say that. What he wanted to do was to lie and ruin every chance they had together, but he couldn't do that to Greg or to Maggie. I just thought you should know, that's all. Yeah, man. Thanks for telling me. His heart wouldn't let him go without saying it, but the words were pulling emotions from the center of him. Treat her right, Greg, okay? She's been through hell already, and she deserves better. Yeah, Greg nodded in understanding. Okay, I will. Well, are you going to congratulate us or what? Ike asked, walking into the office Tuesday morning. Keith barely looked up from the paperwork. Congratulations. Gee, you sound so happy. I would have thought you'd be bouncing off the walls for joy. I am, inside. He sounded as surly as he felt. The talk with Greg hadn't made him feel any better. If anything, it had made him feel worse. We won, you know, Ike said, sitting on the other side of the desk. I heard. You behaved yourself while we were gone? Keith stood, tired of this conversation. I was an angel, just like always. He grabbed his hat and stalked to the door. Time to get some real work done. Don't burn the place down while I'm gone. Ms. Montgomery, Inez said, long after the sun had gone down on Wednesday. Phone call. Already tucked in for the night, Maggie dragged herself out of bed. Isabella was recovering, and they were back to a modified lesson schedule. It was already getting old. She tramped down to the kitchen and picked up the phone. Hello? Maggie, it's Greg. Oh, hi. She sat down on the chair. Somehow she had hoped he wouldn't call back after the last episode. What's up? Listen, I think we need to talk. I'm really sorry about the other night. I was out of control, and I'm sorry. She was tired of this conversation already. She was tired of trying to make herself like him in a way that she just didn't. Hey, it happens. No, I was a total jerk, and you have every reason to hate me. I don't hate you, Greg. I just like to take things slower than that. But I shouldn't have made you ride home in the cab again. It won't happen again, I swear. Don't worry about it. Riding home wouldn't be a problem, because she wasn't planning on going out with him again. He hesitated. Well, I was wondering if you wanted to go out tomorrow night. Disbelief slammed into her. Oh, Greg, I can't. We've had an impossible week around here. Isabella got hurt when I was gone last time. But couldn't they get someone else to watch them, just for a while? No, I don't think so. Dinner, just dinner. No, really. Pre-dinner for drinks or coffee or whatever. Maggie laid her head on the table. No, it's just not going to work, Greg. Maggie, please don't give up on us because I was a jerk. Please. Us? It sounded like a death sentence. It's not because of that, really. It's just that they haven't hired a backup babysitter yet. What happened to the one they had? Long story. Listen, I've got to go. But he didn't sign off. Can I call you again sometime? She wanted to say no. With everything in her, she wanted to say no. But he sounded so crushed, she just couldn't. If you want. Saturday night, Keith got the call he had been dreading all week. After his talk with Greg, he had thrown himself into his coming life with Dallas like a good, soon-to-be groom should. However, just because he was committed didn't mean he was happy. I wanted to make sure we're going to be able to take the jet, Dallas said, clearly stressed out. "I've got to be out of here by the 15th, one way or the other." "Oh," he said, hearing the yelling already. "Dad's going up to Amarillo that weekend. He's taking it. But I'm scheduled for the Friday night flight on American." Dallas sighed. "Fine, I'll tell Rachel." She sounded tired. "Have you checked into any more houses?" "I called the realtor yesterday. We're scheduled to go looking next Tuesday. She's got 5 houses to show us, including 2 of the ones we looked at online." "Well, there's something." She sounded only vaguely impressed. "How about the job search? Have you found anything yet?" "I posted my resume on 3 sites online, but I haven't heard back from anyone yet." This felt like work. Why did he have to have another job? "I checked with a caterer, too. They are a go." "Okay." "You sound stressed." "Huh. I wouldn't know why. I've got 2 more finals, and packing, and moving, and the wedding." Keith's heart sank, knowing he was the cause of a good portion of her stress. "Tell you what, when you get here, you can take a mini vacation. No finals, no stress." "It sounds wonderful." "It will be." Sunday morning it was all Keith could do to keep himself from running up the front steps. He hadn't seen Maggie in what felt like forever, and as crazy as it was, the thought of being with her, even for a few short hours, was all that was keeping him going. He opened the front door and slipped inside. His heart was pounding so loudly, he was sure it was audible in the quiet of the house. He turned toward the kitchen, where he found Inez washing breakfast dishes. "Morning," he said. "Oh, good morning. Miss Montgomery said she'd be down shortly. She's getting the children ready." "Dad and Vivian?" "They had a luncheon in Galveston this morning. They'll be back later." He nodded just as Maggie and the kids appeared at the bottom of the stairs. He had never seen a more breathtaking sight. "Morning," he said softly. "Hi, sorry we're late." "No problem. You ready?" "Guess so." Keith couldn't get his mind to forget that this was probably their last Sunday together. Next week, he would be in Vermont, and the week after that, Dallas would be here with him permanently. The thought threatened to overload his brain circuits, so rather than fry anything, he simply shut them off. He wouldn't think about Dallas or anything else in his other life today. For these few hours, he was Keith Ayer, the real Keith Ayer. And for the time he had left, he was determined to soak in as much life as possible, because on the other side of this hour lay the death of him. He stood next to her in the pew, wishing this was real, wishing it never had to end, wishing it could be a future with her he was looking into. "Welcome, everyone, to our service this May 7th. The rest of the greeting subsided into a swirl of confusion. The 7th? May 7th? Keith's mind wound through and around that date. It had been 17 years. 17 years today that his mother had died. How could he have forgotten? His heart slid through the thought. He hadn't even thought about it until now. Somehow that hurt as much as the date did. The service started, but he didn't really hear it. It was as if in one breath he was back with her, a young boy enthralled with the world. Her soft voice flowed through him like it hadn't in so many, many years. He closed his eyes and soaked in the feeling of her. He was a man now, but when he thought about her, he was once again 12, and 10, and 5, asking her questions, begging for her knowledge of the world and her understanding of his place in it. She had always been able to make things right, with a kiss, a hug, a word of encouragement spoken at just the right moment. Peace, calm, joy. Those were the things he remembered about her, and now she was gone. Yes, she had been gone for many years, but in truth he had never let himself feel her absence until this very moment. Softly, he let his heart whisper, "I miss you, Mom. I miss you so much. It's been so long." Suddenly, at his side, Peter reached up and slid his little hand into Keith's big one, and Keith opened his eyes and smiled down at the child. Love, so strong it ached, flowed through Keith. Yes, his mom had left, but if she hadn't, he wouldn't have Peter nor Isabella. He looked over to Maggie, holding his little sister, and the picture they made seared through him. If his mother had never left, he wouldn't have either of them. It wasn't that he would have chosen one over the other. It was more that only now could he see that even in the pain, there were some blessings. "Mom, I never wanted you to leave. I've missed you so much. But these blessings, I was missing the blessings that are here that I wouldn't have had if the accident hadn't happened." He let his eyes fall closed. "God, I'm so lost here. I feel like I know what I want, and yet it's like I can never have that. Please help me to let them go, to let Maggie go. I made a commitment to Dallas, and I've got to keep it. Please help me." In what seemed only moments, the service ended. He hadn't heard a word anyone had said. He followed Maggie out and to the pickup. However, when they were all strapped in, he glanced over at her. "Would you mind if we make a little stop?" She shrugged. "No, that's fine." He nodded. The last time he had been to the graveyard was when his grandmother had died 5 years before, but he'd never had the courage to visit his mother's grave. Never. It had always seemed so final. But today he would face it. Today he would face the tragedy that had defined his youth, so he could move into the tragedy that would define his future. What Maggie had expected she didn't know, but the graveyard was not it. "What's going on?" she asked in barely disguised panic as he turned into the parking lot gate. "I just want to make a little visit while we're here." "Now?" she wanted to scream. "Today of all days?" It was like fate was playing some kind of cruel trick. Gathering herself so that she wouldn't completely lose it in front of him and the kids, she got out of the pickup and unstrapped Isabella. However, it took everything she had to get her feet moving toward the walkway when Isabella was in her arms.
"What is this?"
Peter asked, and Keith gave him some answer she didn't hear. "Walk. Keep walking. Don't think." Fighting not to let the memories overwhelm her, Maggie walked with him through the small wrought iron archway and past 5 rows of headstones. There, Keith turned to the left, and Maggie followed, pleading with God to not drag this out any longer than it had to be. It brought back too many memories of another graveyard, half a state away. Halfway to the far fence, Keith stopped, and even in her anguish, Maggie saw his. He seemed not to be able to face what lay in front of him as his head was back and his eyes were closed. "I miss her so much." Maggie stepped over to him and put her hand on his upper arm. "I know. Believe me, I know." At that moment, she glanced down at the headstone, and reality scattered. "Oh, my." That brought Keith's senses back to him with a snap. He looked over at her, concern and grief whiplashing their way through him. "What, Maggie? What is it?" She stood, staring at the headstone, her hand over her mouth. It was as if she had frozen in place right there. Fear drove into him. "Maggie, what's wrong?" They... Maggie was shaking her head as horrible thoughts went across her face. Then she looked at him in blank disbelief. "They died the same day." He wasn't following. "What? Who?" It was all she could do to get the words out. "My parents and your mom. They died the same day." Chapter 22. The trip home was spent in stunned silence. Neither of them knew what to say to the other, and so no one said anything. At the mansion, Keith let Maggie out and made some lame excuse about needing to check on things at the stables. She too had things to do, and so they went their separate ways. The rest of the week was pretty much living that 1 hour over and over again. There was the shock of it, followed by the numbness. Maggie did her best to be normal around the kids, but it wasn't easy. She wondered how he was doing, and she even thought about calling to check. But she always talked herself out of it. If he was doing half as bad as she was, talking to her would just confirm that it had actually happened. And somehow making believe it hadn't seemed easier. "For someone leaving for a 4-day party, you look like death warmed over," Ike said on Thursday evening. "You okay?" Okay? It was such a strange word. How could you ever tell you were okay? Maybe others could, but your real thoughts and feelings were so unreliable. How could you ever be sure? Keith's thoughts swept him away from the conversation so fast he didn't realize he hadn't answered. With a concerned look, Ike swung onto the chair. "Is everything all right?" Keith looked at him as the emotions threatened to break through the numbness. Vehemently, he pushed them back. "What do you remember about the accident?" "Accident?" Ike looked like he'd driven around a blind corner. "What accident?" "Mom's. When she was killed. What do you know about it?" The horrified look on Ike's face barely registered in Keith's fuzzy brain. "Why?" "Because I want to know, that's why. I've never really known. One day she was here, and then she wasn't. Nobody ever told me what really happened." Ike got up and went to the filing cabinet. "Well, it was a long time ago. I don't really remember all the details." "Then give me the rough outline, Ike. Come on, I'm 29. I'm not a child anymore." "Well, I don't know that anyone really knows what happened. It was it wasn't real clear. There was a crash, and she went through the windshield. That's all we were ever really told." Keith's grief gripped him. "Yeah, but what did she hit? A tree? A sign? Another car?" "I don't think she hit anything. I think it just happened." This was a one-way trip down a blind alley. Ike came back to the desk. "Listen, Keith, it was a long time ago, and stuff like that is better just put to rest and left alone. There's nothing you can do about it now except accept it and move on." Keith wanted to lash out, to take his anger and grief out on Ike, but that wasn't fair. Ike had pulled him through like no one else had, and there was no reason for Ike to lie. If he didn't know, he didn't know. Keith wrenched himself out of the chair and stalked to the office door. "I'm going to make rounds, and then I'm going to pack for Vermont. I'll be back Tuesday." "Have a safe trip." Greg called again on Friday, and again Maggie told him no. She knew Keith was already gone. The whole house was buzzing with the anticipation of Dallas's graduation and their imminent arrival on Monday. Monday. It seemed to occupy a space in a parallel universe, one in which he was again attached to Dallas's side, and Maggie was left to occupy the little infinitesimal space she called life. Dear God, please get me through Monday, and the Tuesday after that, and the Wednesday after that. "Dallas Celeste Henderson," the speaker at the podium read, and with that, Keith watched her stride across the stage and accept first her diploma and then the hood of her new vaunted position in life. He clapped politely, just like her parents did beside him. They had all apparently decided to leave the unpleasantries until after Dallas's victorious walk. Tomorrow, they would argue. Today, they would celebrate. "This is Keith Ayer, my fiancé," Dallas purred as they made their way around the well-appointed restaurant. "He's Conrad Ayer's son." "Oh," several of their prey said. "Well, it's nice to meet you, Mr. Ayer." Keith smiled, hoping he looked happy about the connection Dallas was so fond of making. They got to the refreshment table after a walk that would have left a camel dehydrated, and Dallas took a flute of champagne and handed him one. However, Keith held up his hand. "No thanks." "No thanks," Dallas laughed. "What does that mean?" "It means I don't really want to drink right now." "Yeah, right." She pressed the glass into his hand. "For later." He'd watered 3 flowering plants and 2 green ones, hoping it wouldn't kill them. If Dallas kept this up, he'd have the whole place watered by the time they left. They'd been at this party for 3 hours, and it was getting boring making small talk with people who cared nothing for him except because of his family's money. Nonetheless, he followed her around like a good little puppy dog until his feet ached from the monkey shoes he'd had to wear. "You know, I'm really beat," he said as the clock slid toward 11. "What do you say we go back to the hotel?" "Oh," Dallas slipped her arms around his neck. "Now there's an idea." Being with Dallas was like taking a turn on a stuck CD. She had 2 modes, sex and money. And then every so often he got really lucky and she turned on the power mode. How she couldn't wait to be at Hayden and Elliott. How she planned to make Junior partner before 28. How with his money and her family's connections, she was destined for full partnership before 32. It was only a question of if she would stay that long. By the time they landed in Houston, Keith had never been so happy to get off a plane in his life. Although he had brought his pickup, Dallas insisted on the mansion sending the limo to get them. So Jeffrey had come for the pickup, and they rode in the limo. The rest of her stuff was being shipped to a storage building until they found a place of their own, which, considering that house hunting started tomorrow, was only a matter of time. "I'm so happy to be home." Dallas lifted Keith's hand, which was intertwined with hers, and arched it over her shoulder. "This is too good to be true." "Yeah," he said, trying to be enthusiastic, but not even getting close. When they drove into the gates of the estate, Dallas just about squirmed out of her skin with excitement. However, the second the driver slid past the main circle, the squirming stopped. She sat up incredulously. "Why aren't we stopping? Where is he going?" "To the guest house, Dallas. Where you're staying, remember?" "Well, yeah, but I thought we'd stop at the mansion first to, say hello." Keith laughed softly. "No one's home." His thoughts went to one who probably was, but he yanked that thought back. "No one? Not even the staff?" He lifted his eyebrows. "You want to say hello to the staff?" She caught herself then and leaned back petulantly. "Fine, we'll go to the guest house." "The square footage is $27.50, the agent said as she led them through the 3rd house on Tuesday afternoon. They were all pretentious, all way over what they needed, and all meant only to impress anyone who happened to be impressible. "That's a little too small," Dallas said, folding her arms unconvinced. "Yes, but it does have a pool and a library." "Well," Dallas said as Keith followed her around the vaulted entryway with a crystal chandelier hanging high above. "It's okay, Miss Henderson. I have lots more properties to see." "Then let's keep looking." If there was a house they missed, Keith's feet wouldn't have believed it. The next morning, as he stuck them in his cowboy boots, they groaned. However, he had chores to do, work. Good, honest work, and he wasn't going to let some little triviality like his feet feeling like they were about to fall off keep him from it. "Are you leaving already?" Dallas asked, coming from the hallway, her silk robe tied just so around her body. Gotta get cracking. He stood and put on his hat over his bandana. She wrapped her arms over themselves like an angry teacher. Ugh, do you have to wear that ugly thing? It's disgusting. I'm working in the stables. The horses wouldn't be impressed with a coat and tie anyway. With a shake of her head, her scowl deepened. We've got to find you something else. If I have to look at that thing every day of my life, just shoot me now. It was a thought. However, he shoved that thought down. I'll be back for dinner. We've got to get Dragnet ready to go for tomorrow. Dinner? Dallas sat down at the table petulantly. But I thought we were going to take a mini vacation. No, I said you are going to take a mini vacation. You've got all day to yourself. He kissed her on the forehead. Help yourself to anything you need. I'll see you later. Yeah, later. And there wasn't an ounce of happiness anywhere in the words. I don't know, Ike said, striding into the office. Paul's got drag on the track, and he's about as jumpy as a June bug. I don't know how he'll fly at the race Saturday. Pulling him's not an option? Tanner asked with concern. Ike looked at Keith, who sat at the desk, trying not to listen. I talked to Mr. Ayer last week, and he's adamant that we're racing him. Ike put up his hands. I've done all I can do. Like clockwork, Greg called on Tuesday and Thursday nights. Maggie hadn't seen Keith in so long, it was almost possible to make herself believe he really was just a nice dream. However, the pit of "this isn't what I want" stayed with her each time she talked to Greg. Friday night, Greg said. Come on, Maggie, why don't you just ask off? It can't be that hard. She put her head in her hand and dragged her fingers through her hair. Greg, we've been over this. They haven't hired anyone new, and I can't just leave. Even for one night? Even for 1 minute. Dallas was out shopping, again. Keith wondered how there could be that many things to buy in all of Houston. She'd already bought new sheets for his bed, which she didn't even plan to take with them, new kitchen towels, new bathroom towels, and 2 new pillows that were on the couch, but not to be touched nor sat on. He'd found that out the hard way. Grateful for a small reprieve from her omnipresence, Keith turned on the satellite radio in the living room Saturday afternoon and sat down in the recliner. With a remote control, he flipped through the channels until the race came in, so clear it was like he was at the track. We're here at the 3rd race at Fair Meadows. The announcer went through the lineup of horses, and when Dragnet's name was called second, Keith sat forward. Elbows on his knees, he tapped his lips with his index fingers. Come on, Paul. Just take it easy on him and get through this race. We can concentrate on winning the next one. Seconds slid by as the track personnel went through their race start protocol. Keith was glad he hadn't gone. Race day always raised his nerves. Traveling frayed them even further. Being around that many people and having to act like an owner rather than a trainer really was impossible. He hated the way people looked at him when they knew who he was. No, this was better, sitting here listening. Alone and anonymous was much, much better. The horses are in the gate. Oh, number 2 seems a bit jumpy today. Settle down, Drag. Just settle down. Calm him down, Paul, and get through this. Looks like they're working with him. A minute slid by. Okay, I believe we are set. The horses are in their gate, and they're off. Keith sat forward, coaching Paul as if he could really see him. Come on, come on. To the first turn we go. The announcer slid through the horses' names. Dragnet in 4th. The pounding of the hooves was so ingrained in Keith, he heard them in his brain even if he couldn't really hear them on the radio. Dragnet seems to be making an inside move. Yes, he has overtaken Melody's Dream on the inside corner. As they round the final turn, oh no. Keith nearly fell off the chair. What? Oh no, 2 of the horses got tangled underneath. It looks like Dragnet and Mustafar are down at the inside railing on the last turn. And Melody's Dream wins the 3rd race at Fairmeadows. Troubadour 2nd, and Walesland 3rd. Keith launched out of the chair and stalked over to the entertainment center where he put his hands on the wood on either side of the stereo. What about Dragnet? What happened to Dragnet? Oh, good. Good news. Mustafar has regained his footing and is being escorted from the track. What about Dragnet? The frustration flowed through him like lava from a volcano. Another announcer took over. This looks really serious for the Ayer Stables horse Dragnet. He's still down on the track. The trainer and medical team are on the track as well. Everyone in the stands is on their feet, and it's clear to everyone this does not look good. Keith slammed his hand into the entertainment center. I knew it! The most gut-wrenching minutes of his life passed as Keith placed phone call after phone call to Ike with no luck. He knew the trainer was knee-deep in chaos, so after 10 tries, he resorted to sitting on the couch with his hands clasped on his knees, praying. Finally, nearly an hour after the race started, his phone rang. His gaze swept over the ID as he hit the on button. Is he all right? Ike sighed so hard it yanked Keith's spirit all the way down. It's bad, Keith. I've never seen one shattered like that. What happened? Where are you? How is he? The vet's here. They're fixing to put him down. Down? Keith vaulted off the couch. No, Ike, no, don't do that. Again, Ike sighed. Too late. I already talked to your dad. The words took Keith's knees out from under him. He approved? He suggested it. Ike sighed again. The vet said it would take a miracle for him to even live, much less to ever really walk again. For his own sake, Keith backed up from the story to keep from thinking about what was happening now. What happened anyway? I couldn't really tell from the radio. I don't know. They were rounding the last turn, and they got tangled. Dragnet's front right leg shattered in the process. I'm telling you, man, it's bad. Clinging to rational, Keith sorted through the accident. How's Paul? Emergency room, too. But he's okay. A little banged up and shaken up, but he'll be all right. And Drag? Ike was talking to someone else, and Keith wanted to shake him silly to get him to stop and fill him in on the details. It's a done deal, Ike said after a moment of pause. He's gone. Even Ike had to corral the emotions to be able to continue. Listen, I've got to get. I'll see you tomorrow, and we'll figure out what's next. Yeah. Okay, bye. Keith hung up the phone without really seeing it. Dragnet was gone, just like that. And now he was never coming back. Grief jammed into Keith's throat, followed in the next breath by anger. Surely there was something someone could have done. Who makes a snap decision about a $250,000 horse like that? His thoughts smashed through the image of his father, and he yanked himself off the couch, grabbed his hat from the table, and stalked out.
I'm hungry,
Peter said after Isabella was asleep Saturday afternoon. Most days during this time, they simply played in the next room until she woke up. But today, even Maggie was getting claustrophobic. She wished they could go out to the stables and go riding, but with Dallas back, Maggie didn't have the guts to show her face anywhere she might be compared to the goddess. Well, let's go down and see what we can find. She took Peter's hand, and they trooped down to the kitchen. Inez was off shopping, and Patty Ann and Mrs. Ayer had gone to a luncheon for some organization Maggie couldn't even pronounce. How about a ham sandwich? Her gaze caught on the blender, and she smiled, although the memory stabbed into her heart.
Can I have peanut butter and jelly?
Peter climbed up the stool by the counter. Peanut butter and jelly? Maggie was surprised he'd even heard the term. Sure, if I can find some.
We used to have those with Mrs. Ortega before she got in trouble and left.
Maggie opened the refrigerator. Why'd she get into trouble? Peter shrugged.
For being in Mom's room. We used to go in there a lot.
The story was beginning to bring real curiosity to Maggie. Oh, why?
So she could play dress-up with Mommy's earrings and stuff?
Mom... But she didn't get that question out as the front door slammed with an earth-shaking crash. Fear pummeled into her. No one just walked in unannounced like that, especially not with a foundation-cracking door slam for emphasis. Peter, you stay right there. Wiping her hands on her pants, she went to the door and turned the corner to the foyer where she met Keith, coming the other direction, full steam. Is my father here? He looked like he might bulldoze anyone who stood in his way. No, I don't think so. He's gone until Monday, I think, Maggie said, shaken by the sight of Keith, who looked more out of control than she had ever seen him. That figures. He glanced over his shoulder. You're sure he's not here? You can go check if you want, but... A scowl marred his face. It was almost as if he wasn't even really seeing her when he looked at her. I do not believe this. This... what? What happened? He glanced at her as anger flashed through his eyes. My sorry excuse for a father told them to put Dragnet down without even consulting me. It was serious. That much she understood, but not much more. Hold on, who's Dragnet? The horse we had racing today at Fair Meadows. Keith seemed not to be able to contain the rage as his body rocked side to side with its power. He went down around one of the turns, shattered his foreleg, and my brilliant father told them to just put him down. His fist came up and then dropped to his thigh. They didn't even bother to call me before they made the decision. It wasn't so much the news as how he was taking it that knocked into Maggie. She tilted her head to be able to see his face, which was bowed. I'm sorry. Is there anything I can do? He reached up and readjusted his hat, clearly fighting not to let any emotion other than rage find the surface. Yeah, can you get me a new father? She hated seeing him in such turmoil, and her voice became soft with compassion. I wish I could. She shouldn't, she knew, but it was all she could think to do. With only a step toward him, she slid her arms through his. At first he seemed surprised, but then he bent his head onto her shoulder and clasped his arms around her so tightly she wondered if she would ever breathe again. Gently she rubbed his back with her hand. It was a funeral hug, just like the kind Mrs. Malinowski had taught her to give. The kind where you don't let go until the hurting person does. And so she stood there in the middle of the Ayer mansion foyer, holding Keith, for no other reason than that he hadn't yet let go. Finally his grip released, and he stepped back. There were no tears, but anguish slashed across his face just the same. Do you know when he'll be back? I think Patty Ann said Monday. Maggie wished with everything in her that she could do something to ease the pain searing across his face. Then I guess I'll be back Monday. She followed him to the door. Are you going to be okay? Sad acceptance slid through the ache. Do I have a choice? And with that, he left. Chapter 23. Hello, how was your day? Dallas asked, walking up and kissing the side of Keith's cheek as he sat at the table, slowly spinning the SpaghettiOs on his plate. They were cold by now. In fact, they'd been cold for 30 minutes, but he hadn't had the energy to even get up. Ugh, the malls were swamped. End of school, all those kids with nothing better to do. It was a madhouse. She walked into the hallway, still talking all the way to the bedroom and back. Tracy is going crazy. Her maid of honor dress came in like 2 sizes too big. They're having to do all these alterations. I'm glad mine is done, and the pictures are done, and the photographer's confirmed." She went into the kitchen and got some water. "Have you heard from Jane yet? She said she'd call when that house she was working on listed." Dallas walked back into the dining room and stopped. "Keith, are you listening to me? Good grief, you look like the morning after the night before." "Yeah," he said, for no other reason than some of the times that was enough to satisfy her. It was as if his life had closed in around him in one swipe. He needed something to hold onto that felt solid and safe. I'm thinking about going to church tomorrow. I was wondering if you wanted to go." "Church?" She made the word sound more like prison. "What would you want to go to church for?" "Well, we had some trouble with the stables today, and I thought—" "Oh, what kind of trouble?" He exhaled, feeling like he was giving her his heart. "They put one of our horses down at the track where it was racing. It shattered a leg." Dallas paused for a long moment, and then it became clear she was waiting for more. "Is that all? You're moping around because of some dumb horse?" Squish went his heart. "Geez, Keith, it's just a horse. What, did you think it was going to live forever?" Why did he bother? He stood from the table, took his plate to the sink, and dumped the SpaghettiOs down the disposal, liking the growling noise it made. "Mom called today. They got 5 more gifts in for the wedding, some of the crystal and the china. But now she's freaking out because we should have had them route all the presents to Texas." Dallas took a drink. "You know my mom. She'll find something to complain about, and if she can't find something, she'll make something up." "So, church is out then?" he asked, verifying in case he had misunderstood. Dallas shook her head and laughed. "Sometimes you are so funny." Maggie had known they wouldn't be going to church, but still it hurt that they weren't. All day Sunday she went through their routine, and every time her mind traced to Keith, she said a prayer for him. She hoped he had found some peace about the horse. She knew how attached he was to them, and any time you put that much effort and love into anything, losing it is like ripping the foundation out from under you. Dear Lord, please be with Keith. Remind him that you are there and that you love him. It was the second worst Sunday of Keith's life, and that was saying something. The night before, he had wanted alcohol worse than he ever had in his entire life, and yet he had thrown all of it out the night after his decision on the matter. However, he hadn't counted on how badly undulled pain hurt. It felt like it would kill him outright, and long after midnight he had resorted to getting up and going to the living room to read Maggie's Bible that he had secreted in the hidden compartment in the entertainment center. Dallas would never understand, not in a million years. So, since her arrival, he had done his best not to think about the little book he had spent many nights reading before her arrival. It was so strange to be 2 different people. So strange. After most of the night spent reading, he found himself on Sunday half real Keith, half Keith Ayer, as he stalked into the stables trying to find something that would take his mind off of not being with Maggie at church. Real Keith wanted answers as to what happened on that track, and to lay down the law that this would never happen again. Keith Ayer, however, knew that wasn't his place. He wasn't the manager here. He was just putting in time. In 2 weeks, he would ride off into the sunset with his new bride, and this place would be a distant memory. As he fed the horses, he stopped at Dragnet's stall, the hay in his hands, the empty stall beyond the gate. With a shake of his head, his heart shattered, and he stepped past that stall to Nell's. "Good morning, girl. How's it going?" He threw the hay over and tried not to think about how empty the stables felt today. His thoughts went to when Ike and Tanner would return, tomorrow at the earliest. Would it be better to ask for every detail like he wanted to, or to just shrug it off as if it didn't make an ounce of difference to him? After all, that's how everyone else seemed to think he should act. It was enough to make a stress headache feel like an aneurysm. Just after lunch on Monday afternoon, the pickup and trailer crept up the trail and stopped at the stables in a small cloud of dust. Keith, who had just returned himself, came out of the breezeway. Ike got out one side of the pickup, Tanner the other. Both heads were down, neither set of eyes came up to meet his. They stalked past him to the office. Frustrated, Keith turned and followed them. "I think I'll go check the water," Tanner said at the office door. Ike nodded and went into the office. Keith caught the door with his fist and watched the younger cowboy stride out the other side of the breezeway. Then he turned his own steps into the office. He ran his thumb under his nose as he watched Ike, who sat at the desk sorting papers. "So what happened anyway?" Ike glanced up, but continued with the paperwork. Keith glowered at the snub. "You're not going to tell me? What's up with that?" It was clear Ike was trying to figure out good words to explain it without angering Keith. "It's just, well, you knew Dragnet wasn't ready." As if that was supposed to make everything comprehensible. "Yeah, we both knew that. So what was Paul thinking, pushing him then?" Keith put his foot on the hardwood chair and stared at Ike. "I thought we talked about that, hanging back these first few races so Dad would think we were following orders." Ike glanced up, and nothing in Keith liked that look. "I was following orders." "Orders? You're the boss, remember?" Keith laughed softly, but Ike didn't respond. The ignoring thing was beginning to irk Keith. "Ike, come on. Talk to me, man. We've been partners in this thing too long for you to shut me out now." Ike stood and went to the file cabinet. "You're out of here in like a week. What does it matter to you?" Livid was in spitting distance. "You're kidding, right?" Keith let his foot slide off the chair. "You know me better than that, Ike. I care about what happens to this place, and to those horses. You of all people should know I haven't busted my butt here for 5 years to just leave. In fact, if it wasn't for Dallas, I wouldn't even move. I'd be here, taking care of things just like I always have." Slowly Ike shook his head. He turned to face Keith. "Look, take some advice from an old cowboy who doesn't hit every trick. Be smart. Get out while the getting's good. Dallas is a great girl. Concentrate on getting married and making her happy. Get your house, set up your life, and don't look back." "Ike, for Pete's sake, what are you talking about? This place is my life. I can't just walk away even if everybody thinks I should." The trainer's eyes fell closed, and his slow southern drawl fell to a crawl. "We didn't have a choice about taking it easy on Drag. Your dad made it crystal clear that if we undermined his orders, we'd be gone." Rage and confusion battled inside Keith. "He told you to race him like that?" "I believe his exact words were, 'Win or you're fired.'" "I need to talk to you," Keith said the second after he opened his father's office door, less than 10 minutes later. He'd already met Patty Ann in the foyer. She confirmed his father's presence in the mansion today, although she had tried to explain that Mr. Ayer was very busy. However, Keith wasn't about to be put off, no matter who stood in his way. The rage boiling in him was going to explode somewhere, and it might as well be in the presence of the one who really deserved it. His father never looked up. "I'm busy." "Yeah? Well, get unbusy. This is important." Keith stepped in and closed the door. "If it's not about how you will be half a state away in 2 weeks, I don't want to hear it. You know, you could be just a little less happy about me leaving. If I didn't know better, I'd think you already have my stuff packed and sitting in my garage." "I thought you said you were here to talk about something important." Keith held his anger in both fists to keep it from spilling over. You told Ike to push Dragnet, and then, when he got hurt, you had him put down before anyone could even assess how bad he really was.
Humph. It was a business decision, Keith. It's called cutting your losses. Besides, we had insurance, so it's no big deal.
No big deal? Insurance doesn't make putting that animal down right. This wasn't about $5 on a spreadsheet, Dad. This was a racehorse, a $250,000 promising racehorse that had more potential than any one I've ever seen trained.
Yeah, and he fell. Big surprise.
Big surprise? Yeah, no kidding. We both know you set him up for that fall. You knew he wasn't ready, and rather than having a little patience and putting in a little effort to get him ready, you pushed him into a race he wasn't ready to run. Then, as if that wasn't enough, you made sure he would fail by heaping your impossibly high expectations on top of an already impossible situation. What in the world did you expect to happen? His father stood.
I expected him to rise to the occasion.
His gaze nailed Keith.
Unfortunately, there are so few on this planet who know the meaning of that phrase.
They were face to face, stare to stare, steel will to steel will. So, everyone who can't stand up to what you think they should be able to do is expendable then? Ache and anger met in Keith's gut. Wow, there's a great life philosophy. Impatience corkscrewed across his father's face.
Look, I can't be wasting money on some stupid horse that will never make it back to the track. I want a winner, not some crippled, money-sucking loser.
The understanding that his father wasn't only talking about the horse drifted through him. Keith backed up and folded his arms. Wow, it must be nice to be so perfect you can sit up here in your mansion and make such sweeping judgments about the whole world. That one deserves to live, that one doesn't. You are the most arrogant, selfish, egotistical jerk I have ever had the misfortune of meeting.
Keith Warren Ayer, I am your father, and I deserve some respect.
His hatred drained down to the sinkhole of capitulation. It was pointless to fight. Respect has to be earned, Dad, and from where I'm standing, you have never done a single thing to earn my respect. Despite Keith's surrender, his father looked like a mad dog ready to attack.
Are you kidding me? You have had everything you have ever wanted. Nice cars, more than a roof over your head, servants at your beck and call.
Keith laughed. And I'm supposed to be impressed with that? Gee, Dad, you aim mighty low in the providing for arena. He had kept the feelings of never being good enough to warrant his father's attention from ever finding the heir his whole life. For the first 12 years, his mother had filled in for the absence of his father. After she was gone, the staff had tried to fill in for both. But the reality was, there was a hole in him that had never been filled because his father was always too busy. Work and other things always came first. He had thought it was just him. Now he saw with perfect clarity that nothing other than the image he portrayed to the world was at all important to his father. If it looked good on the outside, it was worth it. If it didn't, it was expendable. You are unbelievable. You know that, Dad? If someone's not perfect enough for you, you think they are worthless. Well, you know what? I'm tired of trying to be perfect. I am not perfect. I never have been. We both know that. So, I give up. I do. That's it. You can have your mansion and your horses. Run them all into the ground if you want. See what I care. I'm out of here. He turned for the door with a shake of his head.
Now you listen to me. I did my best, his father said. I wanted to give you everything I could, even though I knew it would never be enough to make up for her being gone.
The words ran over Keith's heart, and he stopped at the door.
She always made up for how bad I was with you, but I did want what was best for you, even if I didn't know how to do that.
Keith turned slowly. He needed to know, even though it would change nothing. What happened the night she died?
That was a long time ago.
His father sat slowly.
It was an accident, a stupid thing that just happened. I wish I could go back and change so many things, but the past is the past. I can't do anything about it now.
Why did she go on that trip? Keith asked, not being able to stop the question. It had been running in the background of every moment of his life for 17 years. His father shook his head slowly.
The same reason we do everything. Because she was supposed to.
But what was it? It couldn't have been a meeting. She didn't work. Did she go to see family? What?
No, your mother didn't have a family in Midland.
His father shook his head, first slowly, then more vehemently.
It was just some dumb thing that happened, okay? It's over, Keith. She's gone. It's time to move on.
His gaze fell to the papers as he started writing on the top one again. Why was it so easy for everyone else to just go on with life, and so impossible for him? He put his hand on the knob, but stopped. He looked back over at his father, already buried in work again. Do you miss her? With a look that yanked Keith's heart to the surface, his father looked up.
Every day of my life.
So, I guess you're going to the wedding, Greg said Monday night as Maggie sat in the night-darkened kitchen. I'm sure I'll have to take Pete and Izzy. Maggie held her head up from the table with only her fingers twined in her hair. It had been days since she had seen Keith, days, in fact, since she had seen the outside of the house. They were already busy getting the backyard ready for the wedding, and that meant no one was allowed out there for any reason. 2 days before, workers had moved the back fence and more grass was planted and being watered even now. It was no place for little feet, so they had stayed inside and as much as possible out of view. Mrs. Ayer was in a state, and save for dinner, Mr. Ayer made few appearances. When he was around, he didn't talk. When he wasn't around, there was a tension that permeated everything. Patty Ann had gone so far as to ask if it was necessary to have Peter's karate lesson in the courtyard outside the kitchen, and when it was determined there was simply no other place, karate lessons were canceled until further notice. Gardeners such that Maggie had never seen had also shown up shortly after the grass. They were planting more flowers than God had created, and vast teams of workers were busy even now scrubbing the walls of the mansion until every crevice was clean. You don't get off even for the wedding? Greg asked in horror. Maggie, it's been weeks since you've had a day off. I don't know how you do it. You remember what happens when you do take a day off, she thought, but didn't say. I guess you're going. Of course, I'm best man. Lovely. Oh, who are you walking with? Did you have to ask? Tracy, the monster of honor. More good news. I wish I could get out of it, but Pete and Izzy are the ring bearer and flower girl, which reminds me, we have a fitting for Izzy Thursday. Ugh, I wish this was over already. You and me both. I guess you've got your dress and everything already. The invites say black tie only. Thankfully, Keith sprung for my tux, or that'd be another $500 to spend on top of the gift. Keith. The name knifed through her. I hadn't really thought about a dress. Well, you'd better think about it, or they may send you to the dungeon. He laughed. You know how they can be. Yes, she did. Well, you know, Greg said slowly, I've been thinking. If you're there, and I'm there, maybe we could be there together. Would this nightmare never end? I don't know, Greg. I'll have to be taking care of the kids, and you'll be dealing with the best man stuff. He sighed. Well, will you at least save me a dance? She smiled sadly. You got it. If I wanted to look up an old accident report, how would I go about doing that? Keith asked Dallas as they sat at breakfast Tuesday morning. All night he had replayed the fight with his dad, and one word kept sticking. Midland. Why hadn't he asked? Why hadn't that word jarred his memory into gear when he could have asked? But no, as usual, he hadn't really thought about it until long after it was too late to ask. An accident report? About what? Dallas asked. Her corn silk hair was pulled back from her face, revealing her perfectly chiseled nose and jawbone. She was beautiful, even if not Keith's kind of beautiful. He shrugged. Greg and I were talking the other day, and he was asking about something. I was just going to look into it. Oh, well, if it was publicized at the time, you might be able to dig in a newspaper's archives, or do a search for the date and the location. It'd be like looking for a pin in a gutter, but you could try. She got up and took her plate to the kitchen. Tracy and some of the girls are taking me out tomorrow night, just so you know. I'll probably stay in Houston with her, if that's all right. Oh, yeah. His mind was already back in Midland. That's fine. Tuesday, Maggie went to Patty Ann's office while Inez watched the kids. She knocked. Excuse me, I'm sorry to bother you, but I need to ask a question. Make it quick. The governor's office will be calling with the itinerary any minute now. Oh, okay. Maggie sat down in the chair. I was wondering, how formal do you want me to be for the wedding? I imagine I'll just be working with the kids, so... Patty Ann exhaled harshly. Let me guess. You don't have anything formal. Formal? The word leveled her. No, not really. She pushed her glasses up nervously. I just have my work clothes, pretty much. Terrific. The secretary thought for a moment. Well, if I advance your pay and give you tomorrow off... Oh, I have money from before, but I don't... who will take care of the children? Patty Ann looked like she might hit overload at any second. We have yet to find a suitable replacement for Mrs. Haga. With the wedding preparations in Mrs. Ayer's current schedule, there just hasn't been time for interviews or even applications. Maggie was twisting through the situation as much as Patty Ann was. Then a thought occurred to her. You know, there's a girl that helps out at the stables, Jamie something. She's Tanner's girlfriend. Patty Ann stared at her, clearly having no idea who she was talking about. However, Maggie knew for her own sanity that solution was better than hiring someone she didn't know. Jamie was really good with the kids when we were down there. Maybe she would be interested in babysitting. Under normal circumstances, I would have to check this Jamie person out. But... The phone rang. Patty Ann looked at it and then glanced at Maggie. If you can get her, do it. The house was quiet, blessedly, thankfully quiet. Knowing he needed more than his own wisdom for this one, Keith had spent 30 minutes when he got off work reading the Bible. All day long his mind had been twining through the possibility that he was right, but while he was reading, it was as if the rest of life dropped away. There was something so comforting about reading those words. If he could just stay here and never go back to the real world, he would have. However, there were answers he needed, and so at just after 7, he put the Bible in the little compartment and went to the office where he clicked on his computer and set to the task at hand. With everything in her, Maggie fought calling him to find out about Jamie. She didn't want to disturb him. Moreover, she didn't want to get Dallas and have to explain why she needed to talk to Keith. Something in her told her that if she didn't keep her distance, Dallas would figure out what Maggie wouldn't even let herself admit. So, one excuse after another, she whittled away the evening, hoping the world would mercifully come to an end and she wouldn't have to make that call. 3 dead in 2-car crash. Dateline, Midland, Texas. It had taken almost 2 hours of searching, but when Keith read the headline, he knew this was it. Just before he could read into the story, however, the phone rang at his elbow, and he picked it up. Hello? Keith, hi, this is Maggie. Breath slid from his lungs, and he turned his chair from the computer's glare. Maggie, what's wrong? Oh, nothing, really. I was just calling to see if you might have Tanner's phone number. Nothing in him liked how strained her voice sounded. Tanner's? What do you need his number for? Oh, well, we're needing a babysitter for the kids for tomorrow, and I mentioned Jamie might be interested. Why do you need a babysitter? The thought of her leaving and never coming back smashed into him. Well, Greg and I were talking, and I realized I don't have a dress or anything for the wedding, and... The sentence continued, but Keith's brain had stuck at the words, Greg and I. After a moment, he realized she had stopped talking. I'm sorry, she said. I shouldn't have called. I know you're busy. No! The word jumped from him. No, that's fine. I've got his number. Hang on. Keith stood on shaky legs and walked out to the kitchen. The fading twilight was not enough to read by, so he snapped on the light. So, how's everything up there? Okay, good, she said. The words sounded rushed and thrown into the silence between them. How are the stables? Pretty rough. The whole Saturday thing really threw everybody for a loop. I bet. But they had insurance on him, so I guess it wasn't a total loss. She didn't say anything for a long moment. Insurance doesn't bring him back. Keith wasn't at all sure if it was the softness of the words or the words themselves that ripped the facade of Keith Ayer from his guard atop his heart. But in one breath, he was gone. He sat down heavily on the bar stool. I know, but they all make it sound like it should. They all? The name hacked through his heart. My dad? He said it was pointless to save Dragnet because he'd never race again, and what was the point of having a loser around? He said that? In so many words. Keith exhaled as all the heartache from the last week surfaced. He's so smart in business. How can he be so clueless about life? Maggie didn't answer right away. How about you? What about me? Do you buy into the idea that if there's insurance, life doesn't really matter all that much? His spirit sank. I don't want to, but everybody else makes it sound like that's the only way to think. What am I supposed to do, swim upstream my whole life? Well, I think that depends on if you want to look rich or to be rich. Huh? Maggie laughed softly. Oh, it's something Mrs. Malinowski used to tell me. Maggie, there are people in this world who look really rich, but they are so poor you should feel sorry for them because they are poor where it counts, in the heart, in the places only God and love can fill. And then there are those who don't look rich on the outside, but they are because they know what's important, and they center their entire lives on it. So, I guess the question is, do you want to look rich or to be rich? No one had ever asked Keith that question, and although he knew what he wanted the answer to be, he couldn't let himself believe that was the one that could be. I've got Tanner's number here. Oh, okay, I'm ready. When she hung up with Keith, Maggie placed the call to Tanner and then to Jamie. In a matter of minutes, she had Jamie lined up, and the world itself seemed to line up right behind her. In the dark room, Keith didn't bother to turn the light on. He sat down in the office chair and spun it slowly. The screen was black for having been neglected too long. He swept the mouse to the side, and the screen blinked to life. He closed his eyes, knowing, and yet still hoping. The story was still there when he opened his eyes, and one slow word at a time, he let it seep into him. A Midland couple and a Houston socialite were killed Friday night in a two-car collision on rural Route 72. James Montgomery and his wife Christina, both of Midland, were pronounced dead at the scene. Bonnie Ayer, wife of Houston oilman Conrad Ayer, was airlifted to Midland Central, where she later died of massive internal injuries. Conrad Ayer was also airlifted to Midland Central and remains in stable condition. The chairback caught Keith as his hand went to his mouth. His father was there? His father was there. Somehow, in every single thought he had ever had about the accident, he had never once had his father in that car. The cause of the crash remains under investigation, although authorities said that alcohol was a factor. Disbelief, shock, horror doused Keith's spirit, dragging it down, pushing it down, scratching huge holes all the way through it. That's why they wouldn't tell him what happened. They were protecting his father. Anger flashed through all the other emotions. Ike knew. All these years Ike knew, and he had never said anything. Inez knew. The names slashed one after another through his consciousness. It was possible. Everyone in the world knew, except him. And then one name crowded the others out. It was a face so gentle, it brought a moan of anguish up with it. Maggie.
Like and subscribe to the Staci Stallings YouTube channel so you never miss a second of the story.
This has been Deep in the Heart, written by Staci Stallings. Narrated by Becky Dowdy of Brave Hearts Audiobook Productions. Copyright 2010 by Staci Stallings. Production copyright 2014 by Staci Stallings.